Hello everyone and welcome to Terrified Tales. I'm James and tonight I bring you The Frosted Labyrinth, a chilling story of guilt, buried secrets and a relentless winter storm. This isn't just a tale, it's based on real events that happened to me. During a group therapy retreat to a remote lodge, what began as an attempt to heal turned into something far more sinister. Frost crept across the walls, whispers from the past filled the air, and the lodge itself seemed alive, trapping us in an unending maze. To escape, we had to confront our darkest fears and uncover a truth we were desperate to forget. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you as we dive into this chilling reality-based story. If you enjoy hearing tales like these, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to support the channel. Now turn down the lights, grab something warm, and prepare yourself for the terrifying events of The Frosted Labyrinth. Story 1. The tires crunched over fresh snow as the van crawled along the winding road. The trees loomed on either side, their frost-covered branches stretching like brittle fingers toward the grey sky. Dr. Marianne Chase gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles pale against the leather. The air inside the vehicle was tense, a weighty silence pressing down on its occupants. They had only been on the road for 2 hours, but already the forced proximity had grown stifling. This place better be worth it, muttered Jacob, slumped in the back seat. His voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet like a blade. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with an air of perpetual discontent. "We're in the middle of nowhere." Marianne glanced at him in the rearview mirror but said nothing. She was used to skepticism. It was a common thread among her patients. Defiance was easier than vulnerability. In the seat beside him, Sarah shifted uncomfortably. Her scarf was pulled high around her neck, and her gloved hands fidgeted in her lap. Her nervous energy was palpable, like a taut wire ready to snap. "Remote is the point," said Marianne, her tone calm but firm. "A break from distractions, a place to focus." Beside her, Ben stared out the window, his breath fogging the glass. He had been quiet the entire trip, his eyes fixed on the passing trees. His silence wasn't unusual. Marianne had learned over their sessions that Ben spoke only when necessary, and even then, his words came reluctantly. His withdrawal had deepened. Since the loss of his sister last year, in the middle row, Delilah hummed softly to herself, her voice almost lost beneath the hum of the van's heater. She was the youngest of the group, with brightly dyed hair that clashed with the muted tones of her oversized coat. Marianne had noticed the way Delilah kept her eyes on her phone, scrolling aimlessly through the lack of reception. A distraction, Marianne thought. Anything to avoid stillness. Next to her, Warren had his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He was older than the others, in his late 40s, with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow. His voice carried an edge of authority when he chose to use it, but for now, he simply stared straight ahead, his jaw set. The group was an eclectic mix of strangers bound by invisible threads of pain. Marianne had brought them together for this retreat, believing that collective healing could emerge from shared vulnerability. She had chosen the lodge carefully, a secluded place in the mountains, nestled far from the noise of daily life. Its isolation was a feature, not a flaw. The first flakes of snow began to fall, and Marianne turned on the wipers. The rhythmic sweep of the blades was the only sound for several minutes. "Are we almost there?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Slightly. About 20 minutes," Marianne replied. "The storm is moving faster than expected, but we'll make it before it hits." Jacob let out a low grunt, clearly unimpressed. "Great. A blizzard. Just what we need." No one responded, and the silence returned, heavier than before. The road narrowed as they climbed higher into the mountains. The trees grew denser, their branches weaving together to block out what little light remained. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes swirling in the wind. Marianne felt a flicker of unease, but pushed it aside. They were close. When the lodge finally came into view, there was a collective intake of breath. It stood alone against the backdrop of the mountain, its dark wooden frames stark against the endless white. The lodge was larger than most might expect, with a steeply pitched roof and wide windows that reflected the dim light. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a promise of warmth inside. Marianne pulled the van into the driveway, the tires skidding slightly on the ice. She turned off the engine and turned to face the group. "We're here," she said, forcing a smile. "Let's get settled in before the storm gets worse." They filed out of the van, their boots crunching over the snow. The air was sharp and cold, biting at exposed skin. Marianne retrieved the keys from her bag and led the way up the steps to the front door. The wooden porch creaked beneath their weight, and the sound echoed in the stillness. Inside, the lodge was as inviting as Marianne had hoped. The main room was spacious, with a vaulted ceiling and a large stone fireplace. A thick rug covered the hardwood floor, and mismatched furniture was arranged in cozy clusters. The air smelled faintly of pine and smoke, a combination that felt both comforting and old. "Everyone choose a room," Marianne said, her voice carrying a note of authority. "Unpack, get comfortable, and then meet back here. We'll have dinner together." They dispersed without much discussion, each disappearing down one of the lodge's long hallways. Marianne lingered by the fireplace, rubbing her hands together to warm them. The heat from the flames was welcome, but it did little to ease the unease creeping into her thoughts. The storm outside was growing stronger, and the shadows in the lodge seemed to stretch farther than they should. She shook her head. It was just the stress of the trip, she told herself. The anticipation of the work ahead. She was here to guide them, to help them confront their fears and find a way forward. But as she stood there, staring into the flames, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The others returned one by one, their footsteps echoing in the hallways. Jacob was the last to arrive, his expression sour. "This place is a maze," he grumbled. "I almost got lost just trying to find my room." Marianne smiled faintly. "It's not that big. You'll get used to it." Dinner was a subdued affair. They sat around a long wooden table, the firelight casting flickering shadows across their faces. The conversation was sparse, each of them hesitant to reveal too much too soon. Marianne didn't push. There would be time for that later. As they finished eating, the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. Delilah glanced nervously toward the glass, her fingers drumming against the table. "It sounds bad out there," she said. "It'll pass," Marianne said, though her voice lacked conviction. When the meal was over, they retreated to the living room, gathering around the fire. Marianne guided them through a simple exercise to ease their tension, asking them to close their eyes and focus on their breathing. The flickering firelight and the rhythmic sound of the wind created a lulling atmosphere, and for a moment the group seemed to relax. But then Sarah gasped, her eyes snapping open. "What's wrong?" Marianne asked, her tone gentle but alert. Sarah shook her head, her face pale. I thought I heard something." The others exchanged uneasy glances. "The wind was loud, yes, but it was just wind, wasn't it?" Marianne placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder. "It's just the storm," she said softly. "You're safe here." Sarah nodded, but her hands trembled in her lap. As the evening stretched on, the group began to disperse, retreating to their rooms one by one. Marianne stayed behind, tidying up and stoking the fire. The shadows danced across the walls, and for a moment she thought she saw movement in the corner of her eye. She turned quickly, but there was nothing there, just the flicker of the flames. She told herself it was nothing. It had to be. Upstairs, the hallways were silent, save for the creak of floorboards underfoot. The frost on the windows seemed thicker now, spreading like veins across the glass. In the stillness, a faint sound could be heard, soft, like footsteps, in the snow. Marianne stood at the top of the stairs, her breath visible in the cold air. She stared down the darkened hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. The lodge was quiet, but the quiet felt wrong. And then, from somewhere deep within, the shadows came a faint whisper. Morning came in shades of pale grey, the storm's fury reduced to a light snowfall that fell lazily across the mountains. Inside the lodge, the fire had burned low, leaving the living room in a hushed chill. Marianne woke early, moving quietly, through the kitchen to prepare coffee. She found comfort in routine, her hands steady as she worked, though her mind lingered on the unsettling whispers she thought she'd heard the night before. It had been late, she told herself. The mind plays tricks when you're tired. The others emerged one by one, drawn by the smell of coffee and the promise of warmth. Jacob was the first, his hair disheveled and his expression sour. He muttered a greeting before slumping into a chair near the fire. Sarah came next, clutching her scarf around her shoulders as though it could shield her from more than just the cold. Her eyes darted nervously to the windows, where the frost patterns had grown more intricate overnight. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted quietly, standing close to the fireplace. "Me neither," Delilah said as she shuffled in, her phone in hand. "This place is weird. I keep hearing things." Warren followed soon after, his expression as unreadable as always. He poured himself a cup of coffee without a word, his movements deliberate and methodical. Ben was the last to arrive, his presence quieter than the others, his face pale as if he hadn't slept at all. Marianne looked over the group, her practiced gaze assessing their demeanor. There was tension in the room, a shared unease that none of them wanted to put into words. She decided to address it head-on. "Let's talk about last night," she said, her voice calm but firm. She sat in one of the armchairs, folding her hands in her lap. "Did anyone experience anything unusual?" The room fell silent. For a moment no one spoke, and then Sarah hesitantly raised her hand to her mouth, as though testing her words before speaking. I thought I heard footsteps," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "But when I looked, there was no one there, and then—" She trailed off, her hands trembling slightly. "There was a sound, like someone whispering my name." Delilah let out a nervous laugh, though her eyes betrayed her unease. "Okay, that's creepy, but I swear I heard something too. It wasn't footsteps, though. It was like tapping on the walls. I thought maybe it was the wind, but—" She shook her head, her voice trailing off. "Just the wind," Jacob scoffed, though his tone lacked conviction. He stared into his coffee, avoiding eye contact with the others. "This place is old. It creaks, that's all." Marianne listened carefully, her mind working to connect the dots. "It's normal to feel unsettled in a new environment," she said, her tone measured. "Especially in a place like this, isolated, quiet. Our minds fill in the blanks when we're not used to the silence." Warren shifted in his seat, his gaze fixed on Marianne. "You're saying it's in our heads?" "Not entirely," she replied. "But perception is powerful. When we're under stress, small things can seem much bigger than they are." Ben finally spoke, his voice low and hoarse. "I think it's more than that." All eyes turned to him. He stared into the fire, his jaw tight. "I had a dream," he said slowly, as though the words were being dragged out of him. "I was walking down a hallway. It was covered in frost, and it felt like it went on forever. I could hear someone behind me, but when I turned around—" He paused, swallowing hard. There was no one there. The room fell into a tense silence. Marianne leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Did anyone else have a similar dream?" Delilah raised her hand hesitantly. "I think so. I mean, it wasn't exactly the same, but I remember frost and hallways. It felt so real, like I was actually there. Marianne's stomach tightened. She kept her expression neutral, though her mind raced. Shared dreams weren't uncommon in group therapy settings, but this felt different, too specific, too vivid. Dreams are a reflection of our subconscious, she said carefully. They can be influenced by what we're feeling, what we've experienced. It's possible that the environment here is triggering something in all of us. Or maybe this place is haunted, Delilah muttered under her breath. Jacob snorted, but there was no humor in it. Great. A haunted lodge. Just what I signed up for. We don't know what's happening yet, Marianne said, her voice firm. But we'll figure it out. For now, let's focus on the reason we're here, to work through what brought us to this retreat. The storm has passed, so we'll have some time to center ourselves and start unpacking what's beneath the surface. The group exchanged uneasy glances, but eventually nodded. Marianne stood, gesturing toward the living room seating area. Let's start with a grounding exercise, something to help us feel more present. They reluctantly followed her lead, gathering around the fire. Marianne guided them through a breathing exercise, her voice calm and steady as she instructed them to close their eyes and focus on the sensation of the ground beneath them. She hoped the exercise would ease the tension in the room, but as she glanced around, she noticed Sarah's brow furrowing. "What is it, Sarah?" she asked gently. Sarah opened her eyes, her breathing shallow. I feel like something's watching us." A chill ran down Marianne's spine, though she forced herself to remain composed. "That's just your mind playing tricks," she said. "Focus on your breath." Sarah nodded, but didn't close her eyes again. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though the unease lingered. The group spent their time exploring the lodge, reading by the fire, or simply sitting in silence. The snow outside was deep now, blanketing the world in a stark, blinding white. The roads were completely buried, making the lodge feel even more isolated. By nightfall, the tension had only grown. During dinner, Jacob complained about the cold draft in his room, though none of the windows were open. Warren mentioned hearing faint music, though there was no record player in the lodge. Delilah swore she saw frost spreading across the mirror in the upstairs bathroom, but when she called for Marianne, it had already melted. Marianne tried to reassure them, but her own unease had deepened. After the group retired to their rooms, for the night, she stayed up by the fire, her thoughts racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that the lodge itself was shifting somehow, its long hallways darker, its corners sharper. It was nearly midnight when she heard the first scream. Marianne shot to her feet, her heart pounding. The sound had come from upstairs. She grabbed the flashlight from the mantel and hurried toward the staircase, her pulse roaring in her ears. As she climbed the stairs, the air grew colder, her breath visible in the dim light. She reached the hallway and found Sarah standing in the doorway of her room, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" Marianne asked, rushing to her side. Sarah pointed into the room, her hand trembling. "It was here," she whispered, "in the hallway." Marianne stepped inside, scanning the room with her flashlight. There was nothing out of place, no sign of an intruder. But when she turned toward the window, her breath caught in her throat. The frost on the glass was thicker than before, spreading outward in intricate, swirling patterns. In the center of the frost was the faint outline of a handprint. Child's handprint. The cold in Sarah's room was oppressive, far beyond what a faulty heater or drafty window could explain. Marianne stared at the handprint etched into the frost-covered glass, her mind struggling to rationalize what she was seeing. She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the icy surface. But when her breath clouded the glass, the pattern began to fade, melting into an indistinct blur. "There's no one here," Marianne said carefully, glancing back at Sarah. "It's probably just condensation from the temperature drop." The words felt hollow, even as she said them. Sarah shook her head vehemently, her hands gripping the doorframe for support. "No, I saw something," she insisted. Her voice trembled, barely audible above the distant howl of the wind. It wasn't just a sound this time. It was like a shadow, but it moved. It felt like it was coming for me. The hallway creaked behind them. Marianne turned quickly, shining her flashlight down its length. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the frost-covered walls and the faint glimmer of frozen patterns spreading along the baseboards. She thought she saw movement at the edge of the light, something small and fleeting, but when she stepped closer, there was nothing there. The others began to emerge from their rooms, their faces groggy and annoyed at first, but shifting quickly, to alarm as they noticed Sarah's pallor and Marianne's tense posture. "What's going on?" Jacob grumbled, running a hand through his unkempt hair. He glanced down the hallway and froze when he saw the frost creeping along the walls. "What the hell?" "It's nothing," Marianne said quickly, her voice firm but not convincing. "Just some strange drafts in the lodge. Everyone, go back to your rooms. It's late and we all need rest." Jacob's gaze narrowed, and his mouth opened to argue, but Delilah interrupted. "No, wait. I saw something like this earlier," she said, stepping closer to Sarah's doorway. Her voice was shaky, her usual bravado gone. "In the bathroom upstairs, the mirror, it started to frost over. But it wasn't just the frost. I felt like someone was standing behind me." Warren let out a sharp exhale, his arms crossed over his chest. "You're all just jumpy. Old buildings make noise. The cold's playing tricks on you." "It's not just the cold," Sarah snapped, her voice breaking. "I know what I saw." Marianne held up a hand to calm the group, but her own unease was building. She couldn't dismiss the growing pattern of experiences, shared dreams, inexplicable frost, whispers in the dark. It was too specific, too targeted. "Let's regroup downstairs," Marianne suggested. "We'll talk about this together. Whatever's happening, we need to address it as a group." No one argued, though their movements were hesitant as they made their way down the staircase. The air grew warmer the closer they came to the fire, but the oppressive weight of unease followed them like a shadow. Marianne noted how the group instinctively sat close together, a stark contrast to the distance they'd kept from one another just hours ago. Marianne sat forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She scanned the room, meeting each person's gaze. "We need to be honest with each other. If anyone has noticed anything unusual, anything at all, it's important that we share it now." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ben broke the silence, his voice low but steady. "I didn't want to say anything before because I thought it was just a bad dream. But after what Sarah said, I think there's more to it." He paused, running a hand over his face. "Last night, I dreamed I was in a hallway. It was freezing and I couldn't see where it ended. I could hear someone behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. The more I tried to walk forward, the more I felt like I was going in circles." Delilah shivered visibly, pulling her knees to her chest. "That's almost exactly what I dreamed. The frost, the hallways, the feeling of being followed. It wasn't like a regular dream. It felt too real." Marianne's chest tightened. She leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. "Has anyone else had similar dreams?" Jacob's brow furrowed, his jaw tightening. He glanced away, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. "It's just stupid dreams," he muttered, though his tone lacked conviction. Sarah, still pale and trembling, raised her hand tentatively. "I did," she admitted. "But it wasn't just the hallways. I saw something. A shadow. It was small, like a child, but it moved too fast. And it laughed." The room fell into a suffocating silence. The wind outside howled, rattling the windows, and for a moment the firelight flickered as though threatened by an unseen force. Warren shifted uncomfortably, his stoic demeanor cracking ever so slightly. "Dreams don't mean anything. It's just this place. It's making everyone paranoid. We're snowed in, stuck in a creepy old lodge, and you're all feeding off each other's nerves. Marianne studied him carefully. Have you had any dreams, Warren? His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might deny it outright. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. Fine. I dreamed about the hallways too, but I didn't see anything. It was just endless. No doors, no way out. Marianne nodded, her thoughts spiraling as she tried to make sense of it. Shared dreams like this aren't unheard of in group therapy settings, she said cautiously. Sometimes, when people are brought together with similar emotional struggles, their subconscious minds can manifest similar imagery. It's possible the isolation and stress of being here is amplifying that effect. Manifest similar imagery? Jacob snapped, his voice rising. You're telling me we're all just imagining the same creepy-ass frozen maze? And what about the frost on the windows? Or the handprint? Is that just amplified stress too? Marianne flinched inwardly, but held her ground. I don't have all the answers, she admitted. But I do know that fear can spread quickly in situations like this. If we give in to it, we'll only make things worse. The room grew quiet again, the weight of unspoken fears pressing down on everyone. Marianne glanced at the frost-covered windows, noting how the patterns had grown more intricate, almost like veins spreading across the glass. It felt alive. Ben broke the silence, his voice barely audible. Do you think it's connected to why we're here? Marianne hesitated. What do you mean? He looked up, his eyes hollow. You said this retreat was about finding the root of our fears. What if the root is something we don't remember, something we've buried? A chill ran through the room, deeper than the cold outside. Marianne's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she felt the weight of something unspoken pressing against her chest. The fire cracked loudly, making Delilah jump. She let out a nervous laugh, but it quickly faded into silence. We're just tired, Marianne said finally, though her own voice sounded far away. We'll rest tonight, and in the morning we'll start fresh. Together, we'll figure this out. She didn't fully believe her own words, but it was the best she could offer. As the group reluctantly returned to their rooms, Marianne lingered by the fire, staring into the flames. Her own fear was growing now, creeping in at the edges of her thoughts. The frost on the windows seemed to glimmer in the firelight, the patterns shifting ever so slightly, as though they were alive. The lodge was quiet again, but the quiet felt different now. It felt heavy, like the air was waiting for something, and somewhere deep in the shadows, Marianne could have sworn she heard a faint echoing laugh. The next morning broke with the kind of muted, oppressive silence that only a deep winter storm could bring. The world beyond the lodge was a pale expanse of blinding white. The snow piled so high that even the outlines of the trees were blurred and indistinct. Inside, the cold seemed to have sunk deeper into the walls, the air heavier, each breath visible in faint wisps. Marianne was the first to wake, though she hadn't slept much. Her dreams had been restless, fragments of frost-covered hallways and faint whispers tugging her into a half-conscious haze throughout the night. She rubbed her temples, trying to shake the feeling of lingering dread as she moved through the lodge, lighting the fire in the main room to fight off the deepening chill. One by one, the others emerged from their rooms, their faces pale and drawn. None of them looked as though they'd slept well. Sarah clutched her scarf tightly around her shoulders, her eyes darting toward the windows, as though expecting to see something waiting there. Jacob's usual scowl was deeper, his jaw clenched as he muttered a gruff "morning." Delilah appeared, with her phone in hand, though it was clear she hadn't found a signal. Her screen was blank, and her fingers fidgeted aimlessly across it. Ben and Warren trailed behind, both silent, their expressions tense. Breakfast was a quiet affair. The group gathered at the table, eating in near silence, save for the clink of forks against plates. The frost on the windows had grown thicker overnight, swirling in intricate, almost artistic patterns that seemed to pulse faintly in the morning light. No one mentioned it, though Marianne could see their eyes lingering on the glass, unease written in their every movement. Finally, it was Jacob who broke the silence, his fork clattering loudly against his plate. "Are we just going to sit here and pretend everything's fine?" He snapped, his voice sharp. "This place is wrong. You all feel it, you've seen it, and I'm not sticking around to figure out what happens next." Marianne set down her coffee and met his gaze calmly. "The storms cut us off, Jacob. The roads are buried, and even if they weren't, we'd never make it back to town in this weather. We have no choice but to stay. That's your solution. Sit around and wait for whatever this is to get. A worse," he gestured toward the frost-covered windows, "because let's be honest, it's not getting better." "Panicking won't help," Marianne said firmly. "We need to stay calm and figure this out together." Jacob laughed bitterly. "Figure out what? That this place is haunted? That we're being stalked by some frozen ghost or whatever?" He pushed back his chair, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. "This is insane." "Jacob, sit down," Warren said quietly, but his tone carried a weight that made Jacob pause. The older man's eyes were fixed on the frost, his expression dark. "There's no point running. Whatever's happening here, it's not something we can outrun." The room fell silent again, the tension thick and suffocating. Marianne decided to seize the moment. "We need to address what's happening head on," she said, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her chest. "Last night, Ben brought up an important question. What if this is tied to something we've buried, something we've forgotten?" Delilah frowned, her phone now resting idle in her lap. "Forgotten? Like what?" Marianne hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes, when we experience trauma, our minds protect us by suppressing those memories. But those memories don't go away. They linger beneath the surface, and eventually they find ways to resurface through dreams, emotions, or even physical sensations. That doesn't explain this." Sarah gestured toward the windows, her voice trembling. "Dreams, I can understand, but this is real. I can feel it, I can see it." "I know," Marianne admitted, "and that's what makes this so unusual. It's not just individual experiences, it's collective. We're all feeling it, seeing it. That suggests a shared connection," Jacob snorted. "A shared connection? We're strangers. What the hell could we possibly have in common?" A heavy silence followed his words, and Marianne noticed how the group exchanged uneasy glances, as though each of them was holding something back. She leaned forward, her tone soft but insistent. "I need you all to think carefully. Is there any chance you've crossed paths before? Maybe as children in school or in your hometowns?" For a moment, no one answered. Then Sarah's voice broke the quiet, hesitant and small. "There was a camp," she said, her eyes fixed on her hands. "When I was a kid, a summer camp in the mountains. I think it was around here." Marianne's heart skipped a beat. "What was the camp called?" "I don't remember," Sarah admitted. "I was only there for a week, but something happened. Something bad." Her voice wavered and she shook her head. "I don't want to think about it." Delilah's eyes widened. "Wait," she said, leaning forward. "Camp Winterridge? That was the name, wasn't it?" Ben's expression darkened, his hands clenching into fists on the table. "I remember that place," he said quietly. "I didn't think anyone else would. It was a long time ago." Jacob let out a sharp breath, running a hand through his hair. "You've got to be kidding me. We all went to the same damn camp?" "It can't be a coincidence," Marianne said, though her voice was tinged with disbelief. "You've all repressed memories of that place, memories that are resurfacing now in this lodge. There's something about being here that's triggering them." "What happened at that camp?" Warren asked, his voice low and steady. "Does anyone remember?" No one answered at first. They sat in tense silence, their gazes shifting to the frost-covered windows, to the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. Finally, Delilah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "There was a boy," she said. "I think his name was Sam. He went missing during a snowstorm. They found him days later, but it was too late. He froze to death." The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Marianne felt a chill run through her, colder than the frost spreading across the windows. "Do you remember anything else?" she asked. Delilah shook her head. "Just bits and pieces. But I think we were there when it happened." Sarah let out a choked sob, burying her face in her hands. "I don't want to remember," she whispered. "I don't want to." Jacob stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice tight with anger. "We were kids. Whatever happened back then, it doesn't explain this." "Maybe it does," Marianne said quietly, her mind racing. "Maybe Sam's death is tied to what's happening here. This lodge, the frost, the dreams, it all feels like a manifestation of something unresolved, something buried." "And what?" Jacob snapped. "You're saying his ghost is haunting us?" Before Marianne could respond, a loud crack echoed through the lodge, like ice splintering under immense pressure. The group froze, their eyes darting toward the windows. The frost was spreading again, faster this time, curling in jagged lines across the glass. From somewhere deep in the lodge came a low, resonant creak, as though the walls themselves were groaning. The sound sent a shiver through Marianne's entire body, and then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too close. They weren't alone. The footsteps echoed through the lodge, slow and deliberate, each one heavier than the last. The group froze, their breaths caught in their throats. Marianne's heart pounded as she strained to listen, her eyes darting toward the hallway leading deeper into the lodge. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, as though the building itself were alive and breathing. "Tell me someone else heard that," Delilah whispered, her voice trembling. Jacob was already on his feet, his fists clenched. "Yeah, I heard it," he said, his voice low and tight. "What I want to know is who the hell else is in here." Marianne stood slowly, trying to keep her voice calm. "We need to stay together. No one wanders off alone." She turned toward Jacob, who was already moving toward the hallway. "Jacob, stop. We don't know what's out there." "And what?" he snapped, spinning back toward her. "You're just gonna sit here and hope it goes away? We're not kids anymore, Marianne. If something's here, we deal with it." "It's not that simple," she replied, her tone firm but measured. "Whatever's happening isn't normal." Jacob opened his mouth to retort, but another sound cut through the air, a sharp, high-pitched scraping, like nails dragging along frozen glass. It came from the direction of the kitchen, sending a ripple of dread through the room. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her hands pressed tightly to her mouth. "It's in here." Warren stepped forward, his face unreadable but his posture tense. "If we don't figure out what it is, it's not going to stop," he said quietly. "We have to face it." Marianne nodded reluctantly, though every instinct told her to retreat. "Stay close," she said, her voice firm. "Whatever happens, we stick together." The group moved cautiously, their footsteps hesitant, as they followed the sound toward the kitchen. The lodge seemed to grow colder with every step, the frost on the walls spreading like veins. The shadows in the corners of the hallway felt darker, deeper, as though they were watching. When they reached the kitchen, Marianne hesitated at the doorway, her flashlight trembling slightly in her hands. The room was still, the faint glow of the snow-covered windows casting pale light across the counters. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but the air was colder here, thick and suffocating. Then they saw it. In the center of the frost-covered window above the sink was another handprint, small, unmistakably a child's. It wasn't smudged or faded like the one in Sarah's room. It was perfect, crisp and fresh, as though someone had pressed their palm into the glass only moments ago. "Okay, nope," Delilah said, backing away. "Nope, nope, nope." Jacob moved toward the window, his breath visible in the freezing air. "It's just some kind of prank," he muttered, though his voice lacked any real conviction. He reached out to touch the frost-covered glass, but as his fingers brushed it, the handprint disappeared, dissolving into a swirl of mist that drifted away like smoke. The group collectively recoiled, a sharp intake of breath passing through them. "That's not a prank," Ben said quietly. His voice was hoarse, and his eyes stayed locked on the spot where the handprint had been. Marianne swallowed hard, her mind racing. "This isn't just a haunting," she said, more to herself than to the group. "It's tied to us, to what we've buried." "What does that even mean?" Jacob snapped, turning toward her. "You keep talking about trauma and memories, but what does any of this have to do with that?" Marianne hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "If we're all connected to Sam's death, and I believe we are, then this might be a manifestation of our guilt, something unresolved that's taken on a life of its own." "That doesn't make sense," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I don't even remember him. I don't remember anything." "You don't have to," Marianne replied. "Your mind does. Guilt and fear can linger beneath the surface, even if you've forgotten why." The scraping sound came again, louder, this time, and closer. It was coming from the hallway, the sharp drag of something heavy moving across the floor. The group instinctively huddled closer together, their breaths shallow as the sound grew louder, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was heavy, oppressive, like the lodge itself was holding its breath. Then the whispers began, faint and indistinct at first, like the wind through the trees. But as they grew louder, the words became clearer. They were fragmented, overlapping voices, some young, some old, all tinged with an edge of despair. "You left me. You didn't come back. Why did you let me die?" Sarah let out a strangled cry, her hands covering her ears. "Stop it! Make it stop!" The voices stopped as abruptly as they had started, leaving the group in a suffocating silence. The air felt heavier now, the frost on the walls spreading so quickly they could see it creeping across the surface in real time. Marianne's mind raced, trying to hold on to logic in the face of the impossible. "It's feeding on us," she said finally, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "Our guilt, our fear, it's making it stronger." Jacob turned to her, his face pale but furious. "So what do we do? Just sit here and let it pick us off?" "No," Marianne said firmly. "We confront it. We face whatever it is that's tying us to this place. If we don't, it's not going to stop." "And how do we do that?" Delilah asked, her voice trembling. "How do you confront something like this?" Before Marianne could answer, the lodge seemed to shift beneath their feet. The lights flickered, and the walls groaned, the sound deep and resonant like the creaking of ancient ice. A cold wind swept through the hallway, though there were no open windows or doors. It carried with it the faint scent of snow and something metallic like blood. "Upstairs," Warren said suddenly, his voice cutting through the chaos. "It wants us to go upstairs." Marianne turned to him, her eyes narrowing. "What makes you say that?" He didn't answer, his expression distant, almost trance-like. "I don't know. I just feel it." The group exchanged uneasy glances, but there was an unspoken understanding between them now. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to let them go until they faced it. Without another word, they began moving toward the staircase, their steps slow and hesitant. The air grew colder with every step, the frost spreading faster now, climbing the walls and creeping along the floor. The whispers began again, faint and indistinct, growing louder as they climbed. When they reached the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched before them, impossibly long and lined with doors that hadn't been there before. The frost covered every surface, glinting in the dim light like shards of broken glass. At the far end of the hallway, a single door stood ajar, faint light spilling out into the darkness. Marianne felt the weight of something unseen pressing against her chest, but she forced herself to step forward. "Stay close," she whispered, her breath visible in the freezing air. As they moved down the hallway, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, overlapping into a cacophony of accusations and pleas. The frost beneath their feet cracked with every step, and the air was so cold it burned their lungs. When they reached the door, Marianne hesitated, her hand hovering just above the frosted wood. She turned to the group, her eyes scanning their pale, fearful faces. "Whatever's in there," she said quietly, "we face it together." And then, before she could lose her nerve, she pushed the door open. The door creaked open, revealing a room consumed by frost. The walls, the floor, even the furniture were coated in a thick, glimmering layer of ice, reflecting the faint light that spilled from an unknown source. The temperature dropped sharply. As the group stepped inside, their breaths forming visible clouds in the frozen air. The room was larger than it should have been, impossibly vast, the edges disappearing into a pale, icy fog. In the center of the room stood a figure. It was small, no taller than a child, its shape obscured by frost and shadow. The figure's head was bowed, its body hunched forward slightly, as if weighed down by something unbearable. Frost radiated outward from its feet in delicate, intricate patterns, spreading across the room like veins. The whispers that had plagued the group grew louder, echoing from the figure, as though it were the source of every voice. Sarah let out a choked gasp, her body trembling violently. "It's him!" she whispered, clutching Marianne's arm. "It's Sam!" The figure stirred at the sound of its name, its head tilting upward ever so slightly. Marianne stepped forward instinctively, her heart hammering in her chest. "Sam?" she called softly, her voice cracking under the weight of fear. "Is that you?" The figure slowly raised its head, and Marianne's breath caught in her throat. The face that stared back at her was pale and frozen, its features distorted as though carved from ice. Its eyes glowed faintly, a cold, lifeless blue that pierced through the fog. The frost on its face glimmered like shattered glass. And when it opened its mouth, the whispers stopped, replaced by a single low, resonant word. "Why?" The sound reverberated through the room, cutting through the cold and sinking into their bones. Marianne swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she replied, "Why what, Sam? Why are you here?" The figure's head tilted slightly, its glowing, eyes locking onto her. "Why did you leave me?" it asked, its voice sharp and hollow, like the wind slicing through ice. "Why didn't you come back?" Marianne felt a deep, unrelenting guilt rising in her chest, threatening to drown her. Memories she had long buried began to resurface in fragmented flashes. The snowstorm at Camp Winterridge, the panicked cries of a child lost in the woods, and the suffocating silence that followed when they couldn't find him. She struggled to speak, the words catching in her throat. "I was just a kid, Sam. I didn't know what to do." The figure didn't move, but the frost around, it began to spread more rapidly, the patterns growing jagged and sharp. "You left me," it said again, its voice rising. "All of you. You locked the door and left me." The air in the room grew heavier, pressing against their chests like an invisible weight. Delilah took a step back, her voice breaking. "No, we didn't mean to. It was just a joke. We thought someone would find you." "No one came," the figure said, its voice now echoing with a deep, mournful resonance. "You laughed, and then you forgot." "I didn't forget." Ben's voice cracked as he stepped forward, tears streaming down his face. "I never forgot. I've thought about it every day since. I've carried that guilt my whole life. The Figure turned its glowing eyes toward Ben, and for a moment the whispers returned, faint and indecipherable. "Your guilt feeds me," it said, its tone almost curious. "It keeps me alive, keeps me cold." "It's our fault," Sarah said suddenly, her voice trembling. "We didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. We left you out there. We let you die." The figure's gaze shifted to her, and the frost beneath their feet cracked loudly, the sound reverberating through the room. The group huddled closer together, their breaths coming in shallow, panicked gasps. "We can't undo what we did," Marianne said, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. "But we're here now, Sam. We're not running. Tell us what you want. Tell us what we need to do." The figure tilted its head again, its glowing eyes narrowing. "I want you to feel it," it said simply. "The cold, the fear, the silence." As the words left its mouth, the frost surged forward, climbing up their legs and spreading rapidly across their bodies. The cold was unbearable, searing their skin like fire. Sarah screamed, her hands clawing at the ice, creeping up her arms. But it was no use. The frost was unrelenting. Marianne's mind raced as she fought against the rising panic. "We're sorry, Sam," she said desperately, her voice breaking. "We're so sorry, but this won't fix anything. Hurting us won't bring you peace." The figure hesitated, its movements slowing as though considering her words. The frost stopped spreading and the room fell silent once more. "Peace," the figure repeated, its voice softer now, almost contemplative. "There is no peace, only the cold." Marianne stepped forward, ignoring the ice biting into her skin. She reached out a trembling hand, her voice gentle but firm. "There can be peace, Sam, but you have to let go. You have to stop feeding on the pain. It's not making it better, it's just keeping you trapped." The figure recoiled slightly, as though her words had struck a nerve. The frost around its feet began to recede, its sharp edges softening. The glow in its eyes flickered, dimming for the briefest of moments. But then the whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever. The figure clutched its head, its movements jerky and frantic. "No!" it said, its voice rising. "No! You don't get to leave. You don't get to forget." The frost surged again, faster and more violently, encasing the room in a thick, suffocating layer of ice. The group cried out as the cold overwhelmed them, their bodies trembling under the weight of the frost. Marianne knew there was only one way to stop this. She stepped forward again, her voice rising above the chaos. "Sam, listen to me," she shouted. "If you want us to remember, we will. If you want us to carry this, we will. But you have to stop this. You have to let us go." The figure froze, its glowing eyes locking onto hers. For a long, agonizing moment, the room was silent. Then slowly, the frost began to recede. The figure's edges blurred, its form dissolving into the icy fog that filled the room. "Remember me," it whispered, its voice fading. "Don't forget." And then it was gone. The frost melted away, the air growing warmer, though the chill in their bones remained. The group stood in stunned silence, their breaths shallow and ragged. Marianne turned to them, her voice quiet but steady. "It's over," she said. "But we can't bury this again. We have to live with it." No one replied. They simply stood there, staring at the space where the figure had been, the weight of their shared guilt pressing down on them like a heavy, unrelenting snow. The lodge was quiet again, but not in the way it had been before. The oppressive stillness, the heavy weight in the air was gone, leaving behind an almost eerie calm. The frost that had covered the walls, floors and windows had disappeared, replaced by the natural creak of old wood and the faint howl of the wind outside. The temperature was still cold, but it no longer bit at their skin the way it had before. The group remained in the frost-barren room, staring at the empty space where Sam's figure had stood moments earlier. No one spoke. Their breaths still, came shallow, their faces pale, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. It was Warren who finally broke the silence. "Is it really over?" he asked, his voice hoarse, as though the cold had frozen his vocal cords. Marianne looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I think so," she said quietly. "At least, for now." "For now," Jacob snapped, his voice sharp, though it cracked on the last word. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the length of the room like a trapped animal. "What does that even mean? Is it done or isn't it?" "It's done if we let it be," Marianne replied, turning to face the group. Her voice was steady, though there was an edge of weariness beneath it. Sam didn't want revenge. He wanted to be remembered. That's why this happened, because we buried the truth. We tried to forget, and that only made it worse. Delilah sat down on the frozen floor, hugging her knees to her chest. "But remembering doesn't change anything," she said, her voice small. "It doesn't bring him back." "No, it doesn't," Marianne agreed, lowering herself to meet Delilah's gaze. "But it's all we can do now. We carry it. We don't hide from it anymore. That's how we make sure this doesn't happen again." Ben let out a shaky breath, his eyes fixed on the spot where Sam had disappeared. "I don't know if I can live with this," he murmured. "The guilt. It's too much." "You don't have to do it alone," Marianne said softly. "None of us do. That's the point of this. Why we were brought back together. It wasn't just for him. It was for us too." The group fell into silence again, each of them lost in their thoughts. The enormity of what they had just experienced, and the weight of what they had uncovered, hung over them like a shadow. But the frost was gone, and with it the suffocating fear that had gripped the lodge. "Let's get out of here," Warren said finally, his voice firm but gentle. "We've been through enough for one lifetime." Marianne nodded, her legs stiff as she rose to her feet. "The storm's cleared," she said. "We can head back as soon as we pack." The group moved slowly, their bodies heavy with exhaustion, and their minds dulled by the events of the past few days. They didn't speak much as they returned to their rooms to gather their belongings, each of them retreating into their own thoughts. The lodge seemed different now, less imposing, less alive. The hallways, which had once felt endless and labyrinthine, were simply hallways again. The air was no longer suffocating, though it still carried a faint chill. The frost was gone from the windows, and beyond them, the snow-covered mountains glimmered in the pale morning light. As Marianne packed her bag, she paused to look out the window. The snow outside was pristine, untouched, save for a single set of footprints that led away from the lodge and disappeared into the trees. She frowned, her breath catching slightly, but when she blinked, the footprints were gone. By mid-morning, the group was ready to leave. They piled into the van, the silence between them heavy but no longer unbearable. As Marianne started the engine, she glanced at the lodge one last time. It stood stark and silent against the snowy landscape, its dark wooden frame blending into the shadows of the trees. "Do you think anyone will ever come back here?" Delilah asked from the back seat, her voice quiet. Marianne hesitated before answering. "I don't know," she said. "But if they do, maybe the lodge will feel different to them. Maybe it won't carry the same weight." The van pulled onto the snow-covered road, its tires crunching softly as it began the descent back toward town. The group sat in silence, their gazes distant, their minds replaying the events of the past few days. It wasn't until they were miles away from the lodge that Sarah spoke. "Do you think Sam's at peace now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marianne gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I hope so," she said after a long pause. "But peace isn't something that comes all at once. It takes time, for him and for us." The rest of the drive passed in silence. The mountains gradually gave way to flatlands, and the snow grew thinner as they approached the edges of town. By the time they reached their destination, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows. Across the ground, the group parted ways without much ceremony, each of them promising to stay in touch but unsure if they meant it. They had shared something extraordinary, something impossible, But whether that bond would hold beyond the confines of the lodge remained to be seen. Marianne watched them go, her heart heavy but steady. She knew this wasn't the end of their journey. It was only the beginning. They would carry the memory of Sam, the weight of their guilt, and the lessons of their time in the labyrinth for the rest of their lives. As she turned to leave, she felt a faint chill brush against the back of her neck. She froze, her breath catching, but when she looked back there was nothing there, only the empty parking lot, the faint hum of the town, and the long stretch of road that led back to the mountains. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the frost had left something behind, a reminder, a shadow, or perhaps just a lingering echo of the past. And as she walked away, she thought she heard a faint, distant whisper carried on the wind. Story 2. The wind howled like a living thing, a relentless scream battering against the reinforced windows of the small transport helicopter. The psychiatrists tightened their grip on the armrest as the aircraft bucked and tilted, slicing through the wall of white that had become their world for the last hour. The Arctic outpost had been visible for only a moment before vanishing into the swirling blizzard. Now it was reduced to a hazy beacon on the pilot's radar, an invisible destination somewhere within this storm of ice and snow. "You sure you're ready for this?" the pilot shouted over the noise, their voice crackling through the headset. The psychiatrist nodded, though the truth was less certain. The assignment had come with a dozen red flags, classified memos, vague reassurances, and the unspoken understanding that no one else wanted to go. A research station trapped by unrelenting weather, the sole survivor of a team of 10, and claims of psychological deterioration that had made even the higher-ups uneasy. The only instruction? Evaluate the survivor and determine if extraction was viable. The outpost loomed into view, a cluster of dark shapes huddled against the blinding whiteness. The buildings were squat and angular, designed to withstand conditions most people couldn't imagine, but even from the air, they looked wrong. Snow draped over the roofs in uneven waves, icicles hanging like jagged teeth from every edge. The windows were dark, save for a single dim light flickering at the center of the station. "Welcome to the middle of nowhere," the pilot muttered as they eased the helicopter down. The moment the wheels touched the ground, the storm intensified, as if the blizzard itself had noticed their arrival. Snow whipped against the windshield, and frost crept along the edges of the glass in delicate, spidery veins. The psychiatrists grabbed their gear, a heavy duffel stuffed with cold-weather clothing, medical supplies, and a notebook, and climbed out into the storm. The cold hit like a physical blow, stealing the breath from their lungs and clawing at every exposed inch of skin. They pulled their hood tighter and trudged toward the nearest building, guided by the faint glow of a floodlight. The outpost's main door was heavy, metal reinforced, and coated with a thin layer of ice. It took 2 tries to force it open, and even then, the hinges groaned in protest. The warmth inside was almost overwhelming after the brutal cold, but the psychiatrist barely had time to register it before the door slammed shut behind them, sealing them in a dim, stale-smelling hallway. The walls were lined with peeling posters, emergency procedures, safety protocols, and the occasional motivational slogan. The floor was a grid of scuffed metal panels, slick with melted snow that pooled near the entrance. It was warmer here, but not by much. The air carried a biting chill that seemed to seep straight into their bones. "Hello?" The psychiatrist's voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the hum of an unseen generator. No response. They adjusted their duffel and made their way down the corridor, boots clanging against the metal floor. The place felt abandoned, though there were subtle signs of recent activity. A coat hung haphazardly on a hook, a mug of coffee left half-finished on a table, and faint footprints in the frost-dusted floor near the corner. The central room was where they finally found the survivor. Dr. Everett sat hunched in a chair near a small heater, their thin frames swallowed by layers of mismatched clothing. Their face was gaunt, cheeks hollowed by weeks of malnutrition, and their eyes were the worst. Wide, bloodshot and darting around the room as if searching for threats, they had the look of someone far beyond exhaustion. Everett barely reacted to the psychiatrist's arrival, only glancing up when their shadow fell across the floor. "You shouldn't have come," Everett said. Their voice was hoarse, the words rasping out as if each one cost them something. The psychiatrist set down their bag and crouched nearby, trying to project calm despite the gnawing unease curling in their stomach. "Dr. Everett, I'm here to help. I need to understand what happened here. Can you talk to me about it?" Everett laughed, a hollow sound that echoed in the empty room. "You think you're here to help? You're not. You're just another pawn. It's already watching you." "What's watching me?" "The blizzard," Everett whispered. Their voice dropped to a conspiratorial tone, their eyes darting toward the frost-rimmed window. "It's not a storm. Not really. It's alive." The psychiatrist frowned, glancing at the window where snowflakes swirled in chaotic patterns. "Dr. Everett, you've been through a traumatic experience. Sometimes the mind... You think this is in my head?" Everett snapped, their frail body suddenly taut with anger. "You think I imagined what happened to my team? One by one, they disappeared, and it was always the same. First the whispers, then the cold, and then gone. It's the snow. It takes you." The psychiatrist hesitated. They dealt with delusional patients before, but something about Everett's intensity made it hard to dismiss them outright. The outpost had its share of strange stories, even before this storm. Sightings of lights in the sky, inexplicable equipment failures, and now this blizzard, which had reportedly lasted for over 3 months without pause. The generator sputtered, and the lights flickered, plunging the room into brief, suffocating darkness. When the glow returned, Everett was staring at the psychiatrist with a wild, almost feral look. "Do you hear it yet?" they asked. "Hear what?" "The whispers." The psychiatrist shook their head, unease twisting into something closer to fear. "Dr. Everett, I think we should focus on stabilizing you. You've been alone for a long time, and isolation can..." "You don't get it!" Everett's voice cracked, desperation spilling out like a dam breaking. "The longer you're here, the louder it gets inside you. The snow isn't just outside, it's in the walls, in the air, in your mind." A sudden thud interrupted them. It came from somewhere down the hall, faint but unmistakable. The psychiatrist froze, straining to hear over the pounding of their own heartbeat. Another thud, louder this time. Everett's face twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. "It knows you're here," they whispered. The psychiatrist rose slowly, their breath fogging in the frigid air. The sound came, again closer now, followed by a faint scratching like claws dragging against metal. The scratching continued, faint but persistent, growing louder with every passing second. The psychiatrist stood frozen, their breath caught in their throat as the sound scraped at the edge of their nerves. "It's starting," Everett muttered, their voice barely above a whisper. They pulled their knees to their chest, retreating into the oversized layers of clothing like a child hiding from a monster under their blanket. "What's starting?" the psychiatrist asked, though they weren't sure they wanted the answer. Everett didn't respond immediately. Their gaze darted toward the frost-covered window, then back to the door, as if expecting something or someone to burst through at any moment. "The snow's found you," they finally said. "It's testing you. It starts small, scratches, whispers, but it doesn't stop, not until you break." The psychiatrists swallowed hard, forcing themselves to focus. "Dr. Everett," they said, keeping their voice steady despite the knot of unease tightening in their chest. You've been isolated for a long time. What you're experiencing could be a result of prolonged stress, sleep deprivation, or even hypothermia. These things can make the mind... A loud crash interrupted them, echoing from the hallway like something heavy being knocked over. The psychiatrist flinched, their heart pounding as the sound ricocheted through the stillness. Everett looked up sharply, their wide, bloodshot eyes locking onto the psychiatrist. "You think it's in my head?" they said, their voice shaking with anger and fear. "You think I'm imagining it? Fine. Go look. See for yourself." For a moment, the psychiatrist considered refusing, staying in the relative safety of the room. But a part of them, perhaps the same part that had agreed to take this assignment in the first place, refused to back down. They couldn't help Everett or themselves if they let fear take control. "I'll be right back," they said, grabbing a flashlight from their bag. Everett didn't respond, but their expression said enough. "You won't like what you find." The hallway stretched out before the psychiatrist like a tunnel into darkness, the flickering overhead lights casting long, trembling shadows on the walls. Their boots clanged against the metal floor as they moved toward the source of the noise, each step heavier than the last. The flashlight beam sliced through the dimness, illuminating patches of frost on the walls and floor. The deeper they went, the colder it seemed to get, until their breath hung in the air like smoke. Halfway down the hall, they found the source of the crash. A metal storage cabinet lay tipped on its side, its contents, a jumble of tools, notebooks, and wires, spilled across the floor. The psychiatrist crouched to examine it, their gloved fingers brushing against the icy surface. There were no obvious signs of how it had fallen. No dents, no scratches, no reason for it to have tipped over on its own. But as they stood, something caught their eye. On the far wall, just above the baseboard, was a handprint. It was faint but unmistakable. The frost on the metal smeared in the shape of a palm and 5 fingers. The psychiatrist's first thought was that it must have been Everett's, but then they noticed the size. It was smaller, like a child's. A hand. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature crept down their spine. "Hello?" they called, their voice echoing down the empty corridor. No answer. They turned back toward the room where they'd left Everett, the flashlight beam bouncing slightly with each hurried step. The shadows seemed to shift and stretch around them, and for a brief, stomach-dropping moment, they thought they saw something move out of the corner of their eye. When they turned to look, there was nothing there. Back in the room, Everett hadn't moved from their spot near the heater. They looked up as the psychiatrist entered, their expression one of grim satisfaction. "You saw it, didn't you?" Everett said. "I saw something," the psychiatrist admitted. They didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the handprint was hard to explain. "Do you know who else could have been in the hallway?" Everett laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that sent a shiver through the room. "There's no one else, just you, me, and it." Before the psychiatrist could respond, the lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness. This time the darkness lasted longer. The seconds stretched out, and in the oppressive silence, the psychiatrist became acutely aware of their own breathing, shallow and rapid. The cold pressed in from all sides, seeping into their clothes and skin. Somewhere in the darkness, they thought they heard something, a faint, rhythmic sound, like breathing. When the lights sputtered back to life, Everett was staring at the door. "What is it?" the psychiatrist asked, their voice hushed. Everett didn't answer right away. They pointed a trembling finger toward the doorframe, where a thin layer of frost had begun to spread, spider-webbing outward like cracks in glass. "It's getting closer," Everett whispered. The psychiatrist took an involuntary step back, their mind racing. This wasn't normal. None of this was normal. But before they could say anything, a new sound filled the air. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper drifting through the room like smoke. It was impossible to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Cold, insistent, and somehow familiar. Do you hear it now? Everett asked. The psychiatrist didn't answer. They were too focused on the whisper, straining to catch the words as they danced just out of reach. It felt as though the sound was coming from inside their own head, burrowing into their thoughts like a worm. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whisper stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the heater. "We're not alone anymore," Everett said, their voice barely audible. The psychiatrist turned toward the window, where frost had begun to creep across the glass in jagged, uneven patterns. Outside, the snow swirled in chaotic spirals, and for a brief moment, they thought they saw a shape moving in the storm. A dark silhouette, tall and thin, barely distinguishable. From the shifting white, when they blinked, it was gone. The next morning, if it could even be called morning, the storm outside showed no signs of relenting. The blizzard howled and screamed, rattling the metal walls of the outpost like a caged animal. The faint light filtering through the frost-coated windows was dim and grey, offering no sense of time or clarity. The psychiatrist sat at a small rusted table in the mess hall, staring down at their notebook. They had started jotting down observations about Everett and the strange phenomena at the outpost. But now the notes felt disjointed, incomplete. Their handwriting, usually neat and methodical, looked rushed and uneven, as if their own thoughts were slipping through their fingers. Across the room, Everett sat slumped in a chair, silent and unmoving. The layers of clothing they wore made them look almost skeletal, and their sunken eyes seemed fixed on some point far beyond the room. The heater hummed weakly nearby, barely pushing back the bone-deep chill that had settled over the station. "Dr. Everett," the psychiatrist said, trying to inject some semblance of normalcy into their tone, "I'd like to continue our conversation from yesterday. Can you tell me more about what happened to your team?" Everett didn't respond at first. They were clutching a mug of coffee that had gone cold long ago, their fingers trembling as they held it. Finally, they spoke, their voice hoarse and distant. "You already know how it ends. They're gone." "I understand that," the psychiatrist said gently, "but I need to understand why. What exactly happened? Was it the storm, the isolation, something else?" Everett's lips twitched, almost forming a bitter smile. "Something else," they muttered. They set the mug down with a shaking hand and leaned forward, their gaze locking onto the psychiatrist with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "You still think this is in my head, don't you?" "I think trauma can affect how we perceive things," the psychiatrist said carefully, "and prolonged isolation can—" "Stop!" Everett's voice cut through the room like a knife. "Stop trying to explain it. Stop trying to make it fit into your neat little boxes. You don't understand what's out there." "Then help me understand," the psychiatrist said. Everett hesitated, their jaw tightening as if the words they wanted to say were physically painful to speak. Finally, they leaned back in their chair, exhaling shakily. "It started small," they said. "Little things. Equipment malfunctioning, lights flickering. We thought it was just the storm messing with the power. But then we started hearing things, voices, whispers. At first, we thought it was just the wind, but it wasn't. The whispers would call us by name. They knew things about us, things we'd never told anyone. And the cold, it wasn't just outside, it was inside, creeping into everything. No matter how many heaters we used, it never got warm enough." The psychiatrist scribbled notes, their hand trembling slightly as they wrote. "And the disappearances?" they prompted. Everett's expression darkened. "One by one," they said. "First it was Jacobs. He went out to check the perimeter and never came back. We searched for him, but all we found were his footprints in the snow. They just stopped like he'd been plucked out of existence." They paused, their eyes darting to the frost-covered window. "Then it was Ramirez. She started saying she could see people in the storm calling to her. We tried to keep her inside, but one night she just walked out. We found her coat the next day, frozen solid, no sign of her body." A chill ran down the psychiatrist's spine. "And you're saying this thing in the storm is responsible?" Everett nodded slowly. "It doesn't just kill you. It gets inside your head, makes you doubt everything, makes you doubt yourself. And the more you doubt, the stronger it gets." The others didn't stand a chance. They tried to fight it, to rationalize it, but that only made it worse. The psychiatrist's pen paused mid-sentence. "Why do you think it hasn't taken you yet?" Everett's expression twisted into something unreadable. Part fear, part resignation. "Because it wants me to suffer," they said. "It feeds on despair, and I've got more of that than anyone." Before the psychiatrist could respond, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deeper in the station, followed by a low, metallic groan. The sound reverberated through the walls, and for a moment it felt as though the entire outpost was shuddering. "What was that?" the psychiatrist asked, rising from their chair. Everett didn't move. "It's here," they said simply. The psychiatrist grabbed their flashlight and headed toward the noise, their heart pounding with each step. The corridor leading to the back of the station was darker than they remembered, the overhead lights flickering in erratic bursts. The air grew colder as they moved, their breath fogging in the dim light. They reached the storage room where the sound had come. Froman found the door slightly ajar. Pushing it open, they shone the flashlight inside. The room was a mess. Shelves had been overturned, their contents scattered across the floor. Boxes of supplies lay broken open, their contents spilling out in chaotic piles. But it wasn't the mess that held the psychiatrist's attention. It was the writing on the walls, scrawled in frost. The words covered every surface, overlapping and crisscrossing in a chaotic, frenzied pattern. Some of the words were in English, others in languages the psychiatrist didn't recognize. But one phrase repeated over and over, larger and clearer than the rest. "It knows you." The psychiatrist's flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, they thought they saw something move in the corner of the room. A shadow darker than the others, curling and shifting like smoke. When they turned the flashlight toward it, there was nothing there. A faint whisper drifted through the air, barely audible. They stumbled back into the hallway, their breath coming in short, panicked gasps. As they turned to head back to the mess hall, they froze. The frost on the walls was spreading, creeping forward in delicate, jagged patterns, as though it were alive and reaching for them. They ran. When they burst back into the mess hall, Everett was exactly where they'd left them, sitting motionless in their chair. "What happened?" Everett asked, though their tone suggested they already knew. The psychiatrist didn't answer. They couldn't bring themselves to say it aloud. But Everett smiled anyway, a grim, knowing smile. "It's starting to like you," they said. The mess hall felt colder now. The weak hum of the heater couldn't push back the chill that seeped into the air, into their skin, into their bones. The psychiatrist stood near the door, trying to steady their breathing. They could still feel the frost-covered walls of the storage room in their mind, the words etched into the ice like they had been waiting for someone to see them. Everett hadn't moved. They sat in their chair, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow and distant, but their lips twitched into a faint, bitter smile. "You saw it, didn't you?" The psychiatrist hesitated, then nodded slowly. "The writing in the storage room, it wasn't there before, was it?" Everett let out a dry laugh, more like a cough. "No, it wasn't. It doesn't leave messages until it knows you're paying attention, until you've let it in." 2. Psychiatrists shook their head. "I haven't let anything in. There's a logical explanation for all of this. The storm, the isolation, the stress. It's making us see things that aren't real." "Real?" Everett leaned forward, their voice low and sharp. "You think this isn't real? You think I've been sitting here for months losing my mind over nothing?" "I think trauma can do terrible things to the mind," the psychiatrist said, trying to keep their voice steady. "I think grief, fear, and isolation can make us see patterns where there are none." Everett's smile twisted into something darker. You're trying so hard to make sense of it, just like the others, but you're already starting to feel it, aren't you? The cold that doesn't go away. The whispers that get louder when you try to ignore them. You can rationalize all you want, but it doesn't matter. It's here now. The psychiatrist opened their mouth to respond, but the words died on their tongue. Because Everett was right. Something had changed. The air felt heavier, the walls closer. Even now, the faintest sound, something just beyond the range of hearing, itched at the edge of their senses. A whisper. They turned away from Everett and focused on their notes, flipping through the pages in an effort to ground themselves. "Let's stick to the facts," they said, their voice firmer than they felt. "You said the team started disappearing one by one. You said the storm grew stronger and you started hearing whispers. Was there a specific event that triggered all of this? Something the team was working on?" For a long moment, Everett didn't answer. Then they stood, their movements slow and deliberate. They crossed the room to a small cabinet near the far. "Ubal!" Their boots crunching softly against the frost-lined floor. From the cabinet, they pulled out a worn, leather-bound notebook and handed it to the psychiatrist. "This was Ramirez's," Everett said. "She was one of the researchers. She kept a log of everything right up until the day she—" Their voice faltered and they looked away. The psychiatrist took the notebook, their gloved fingers brushing against the cracked leather. The edges of the pages were stiff with frost, but the writing inside was still legible. The entries started, out clinical, detailing the team's daily routines and observations about the weather. But as the days went on, the tone shifted. Day 15. The storm hasn't let up. It's getting harder to keep the generators running in this cold. Jacob says he hears voices at night, but I think he's just overtired. We all are. Day 23. Something's wrong with the equipment. The radios keep cutting out, and the temperature. Sensors are giving readings that don't make sense. Everett says it's just the storm interfering, but it feels like something else. Something deliberate. Day 31. The whispers are real. They call to me when I'm alone, saying my name over and over. Last night I thought I saw someone standing outside my window, but when I looked again, they were gone. The snow is alive. I know how that sounds, but I can feel it watching me. The entries stopped abruptly after that. The last page was blank, except for a single word scrawled across the center. Run. The psychiatrist closed the notebook, their hands trembling. This doesn't prove anything, they said, though their voice lacked conviction. You think she just imagined all of that? Everett asked, their tone sharp. You think she wrote run for no reason? I think she was scared. I think fear can make us see things that aren't there. Everett laughed again, the sound harsh and hollow. You keep telling yourself that. See how far it gets you. The lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for several agonizing seconds before sputtering back to life. The psychiatrist's breath hitched as they noticed something new, a thin layer of frost creeping across the floor, stretching toward them like reaching fingers. They stumbled back, their pulse pounding in their ears. What? What is that? It's how it starts, Everett said. Their voice was calm now, almost resigned. It's testing you, seeing how much you can take before you break. The psychiatrist shook their head, trying to steady their thoughts. No, there has to be an explanation. The generators, the temperature, it's mechanical, environmental. You really don't get it, do you? Everett said, stepping closer. It doesn't care what you believe. It doesn't care how rational you think you are. It's already inside, and it's not going to stop until there's nothing left of you. The whisper returned, louder this time. It echoed through the room, cold and hollow, and this time the psychiatrist could make out words. Come outside. The voice was faint, layered with static, but unmistakable. It felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. Inside their head, outside the walls, in the very air they breathed. The frost crept closer, winding its way across the floor in delicate, jagged patterns. The psychiatrist backed away, their heart racing. "Don't listen to it," Everett said. Their voice was steady, but their eyes were filled with fear. "That's how it gets you. It makes you listen, makes you doubt yourself. And once you start doubting..." The whisper grew louder, insistent. "Come outside!" The psychiatrists clapped their hands over their ears, but it didn't help. The voice was inside them now, worming its way into their thoughts. They stumbled toward the door, their mind a tangle of fear and confusion. The whisper called to them, pulling them toward the blizzard outside, and for a moment they felt the overwhelming urge to open the door and step into the storm. But Everett's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Stop. Don't. Let it in." The psychiatrist froze, their hand inches from the door. Slowly they stepped back, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The whisper faded, replaced by a suffocating silence. Everett sank back into their chair, their expression grim. "It's stronger now," they said. "It won't stop until you're just like the rest of them." The psychiatrist didn't respond. They were too busy staring at the frost-covered door where a single word had appeared, etched into the ice like a warning. Soon. The frost on the door didn't melt, even with the heater humming and the psychiatrist's breath warming the metal near the edges. The word etched into the ice, "soon," remained. It almost seemed to grow clearer, sharper, the longer they stared at it. The silence in the room was so thick it felt alive, pressing against their ears like cotton stuffed into their head. Everett sat slumped in the corner, watching them with tired, knowing eyes. "It's inside your head now," they said. "Once you've seen it, once you've heard it, it doesn't let go." The psychiatrist's throat tightened. They turned away from the door, trying to ignore the weight of Everett's words. They couldn't let themselves believe it. Not yet. Not when there was still so much they didn't understand. "I need to know more," the psychiatrist said, their voice low but firm. "There has to be something you're not telling me, something the team was working on. What was Ramirez researching? What kind of experiments were you running here?" Everett shook their head, a bitter laugh escaping their lips. "Experiments? You think this is about science, about data? None of that matters anymore. Ramirez thought she could understand it. She thought if we figured out what it wanted, we could stop it. But the more we studied, the more we gave it. And it learned us." "What do you mean it learned you?" Everett's gaze shifted to the frost-covered window. The blizzard outside howled like a living thing, rattling the glass in its frame. "It feeds on us," they said, "on our fear, our despair. The more we fought it, the stronger it got. And when Ramirez started keeping her notes, when she started listening to the whispers," their voice trailed off, and they shivered despite the layers of clothing wrapped around them. "She was the first to go. Not physically at first, but you could see it in her eyes, like she wasn't there anymore, like it had hollowed her out and left her body behind." The psychiatrists tightened their grip on their notebook. "This thing, whatever it is, are you saying it's alive, intelligent?" Everett laughed again, harsher this time. "Alive? Intelligent? You're still trying to define it, still trying to fit it into your neat little categories. But it doesn't work like that. It's not something you can study or measure. It's bigger than that, bigger than us." Before the psychiatrist could respond, the lights flickered. The dim bulbs overhead buzzed weakly, and then the room was plunged into darkness. The sudden silence was deafening. Even the sound of the wind seemed to vanish, leaving nothing but the psychiatrist's ragged breathing. They fumbled for their flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness as they swept it across the room. "Everett," they called, their voice shaky. No response. The flashlight found Everett's chair, but it was empty. The psychiatrist's stomach dropped as they scanned the rest of the room, the beam of light trembling in their hands. "Everett?" they called again, louder this time. A faint sound echoed from the hallway. It was soft, almost imperceptible. but unmistakable. The shuffle of footsteps on the metal floor. The psychiatrist's pulse quickened as they moved toward the sound, their flashlight illuminating the frost-lined walls. The temperature in the hallway was noticeably colder now, each breath hanging in the air like a cloud. They turned a corner and froze. Everett was standing at the far end of the corridor, their back to the psychiatrist. Their posture was stiff, unnatural, and their head was tilted at an odd angle, as if they were listening to something. "Everett," the psychiatrist said cautiously, taking a step closer. "What are you doing?" Everett didn't respond. They remained motionless, their arms hanging limply at their sides. The flashlight beam caught the frost creeping up their boots, snaking along the floor like tendrils of ice. "Everett," the psychiatrist repeated, their voice louder now. Slowly, Everett turned their head. Their face was pale, their eyes wide and unblinking. Frost clung to their hair and eyebrows, and their lips were faintly blue. When they spoke, their voice was low and hollow, as if it were coming from somewhere far away. "It's here," they said. "It's watching us." A sudden gust of wind roared through the hallway, though the doors and windows remained closed. The psychiatrist staggered back, shielding their face as the icy blast whipped around them. The flashlight flickered, and, for a moment, the beam illuminated something in the shadows behind Everett. It was a shape, tall and thin, its edges blurred by the swirling frost. It was almost human, but not quite. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, like smoke given form. The flashlight flickered again, and the shape was gone. "Everett, get back here!" the psychiatrist shouted, their voice echoing down the corridor. But Everett didn't move. They simply stood there, their gaze fixed on the spot where the shadow had been. Then, without warning, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness at the end of the hall. The psychiatrist hesitated, their heart pounding. Every instinct screamed at them to turn back, to barricade themselves in the mess hall, and wait for daylight. If daylight even existed in this endless storm, but something pulled them forward, a gnawing need to understand what was happening. They followed Everett's trail, their flashlight beam bouncing against the frost-coated walls. The whispers started again, faint and disjointed, like a radio signal cutting in and out. "Come closer." The voice wasn't Everett's. It was something else, something colder, darker. It seemed to echo inside their mind, threading through there, and thoughts like icy tendrils. The corridor ended at a heavy metal door, half covered in frost. The psychiatrist reached for the handle, their gloved fingers trembling. Behind the door, the whispers grew louder. "Let us in." They hesitated, their breath fogging the air as they tried to steel themselves. The handle was freezing to the touch, the frost biting through their gloves. With a deep breath, they turned it and pushed the door open. The room beyond was empty, save for a single chair in the center. The frost on the walls was thicker here, glittering in the flashlight beam like shards of broken glass. On the floor, a set of footprints led toward the chair and stopped. The psychiatrist stepped closer, their heart pounding. The whispers were deafening now, wrapping around them like a suffocating shroud. When they reached the chair, they saw what was lying on it, Everett's coat folded neatly, with a layer of frost forming over the fabric. There was no sign of Everett. The whispers stopped, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. And then, from somewhere deep within the blizzard, a single voice spoke, clear and unmistakable. "Your turn." The door slammed shut behind the psychiatrist, the echoing clang reverberating through the frosted room. They spun around, gripping the flashlight tighter, but there was no one there. The whispers were gone, but the silence that replaced them was far worse, dense, smothering, pressing against their ears like the weight of the storm itself. Everett was gone. Their coat was all that remained, the frost spreading across its surface as though the cold were alive, claiming it piece by piece. The psychiatrist stood frozen, staring at the footprints in the snow that ended abruptly at the chair. "Everett," they called, their voice cracking in the stillness. No answer. The flashlight flickered, the beam dimming for a moment before stabilizing. It cast long, trembling shadows across the walls, each one jagged and unnatural. The psychiatrist felt the cold creeping into their body, into their thoughts, making their limbs heavy and their mind slow. Something about this room was wrong. They backed away from the chair, their boots crunching softly on the frost-coated floor. Every instinct screamed at them to leave, to retreat to the relative safety of the mess hall, but their feet carried them toward the far corner of the room instead. There, etched into the ice covering the wall, were more words. "It takes what you..." Udil, the psychiatrist stared at the message, their breath fogging the air. The words seemed to shimmer in the dim light, almost as though they were moving, shifting with the patterns of the frost. They ran a gloved hand over them, but the ice wouldn't budge. "What do you want?" they muttered under their breath, their voice shaking. The words didn't change, but then from somewhere deep in the walls came the sound of something moving. It wasn't loud, just a faint scraping, like nails against ice. But it sent a jolt of terror through the psychiatrist's body. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to come from directly behind them. They spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the frost-laden air. But there was nothing there. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the light from the flashlight dimmed again, its battery straining against the overwhelming cold. The psychiatrist's breath hitched as they saw their own reflection in the frost-covered window, but it wasn't their reflection. The figure staring back at them was wrong. It looked like them. Same face, same clothes, but the eyes were hollow, black voids, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque, frozen smile. The frost on the window crept outward from the figure's hands as if it were reaching for them. The psychiatrist stumbled back, their flashlight shaking in their grip. When they blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only the frost-covered glass. They turned and bolted for the door, their breath coming in shallow gasps. The metal handle was ice cold, burning through their gloves as they twisted it. For a moment, it wouldn't budge, as if the frost had fused it shut. Then, with a groan of protest, the door swung open and they stumbled back into the corridor. The hallway was darker than before. The flickering overhead lights had gone out entirely, leaving only the faint glow of frost reflecting the beam of the flashlight. The air felt heavier, pressing down on their chest like an invisible weight. They started moving, their boots clanging against the metal floor. Each step echoed unnaturally, the sound stretching out into the silence. "You're not alone." The whisper came from everywhere at once. The psychiatrist froze, their heart racing. The beam of their flashlight trembled as they scanned the corridor. But there was nothing there. Then they saw it. At the far end of the hallway, just barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. It was tall and thin, its body obscured by the swirling frost, but its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. 2 pinpoints of pale blue light. The psychiatrist's breath caught in their throat. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was overwhelming. It felt like the air itself was bending around it, warping reality in subtle, terrifying ways. They took a step back, and the figure took a step forward. "No!" the psychiatrist whispered, shaking their head. "You're not real! You're not..." The lights flickered back on for a split second, and the figure was suddenly much closer. Its form was clearer now, inhumanly tall, with elongated limbs and a body that seemed to shift and shimmer like snow caught in a whirlwind. Its face was featureless, save for those glowing blue eyes. The flashlight slipped from the psychiatrist's hand, clattering to the floor. They turned and ran, their boots slipping on the frost-covered floor as they raced back toward the mess hall. The whispers grew louder with every step, filling their head with a cacophony of voices. Some were pleading, some were angry, and some were laughing cold and cruel. "Let us in. It's so cold you can't run." The mess hall door was just ahead. They reached it, their hands fumbling with the handle as the whispers swirled around them. The frost on the walls seemed to pulse and writhe, alive and hungry. Finally, the door swung open and they stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind them. The whispers stopped. The room was eerily silent, the only sound their ragged breathing. They collapsed into a chair, their hands shaking as they tried to process what had just happened. The frost on the walls hadn't spread into the mess hall yet, but it was close. They could see it creeping along the edges of the doorframe, inching forward with agonizing slowness. They glanced at the chair where Everett had been sitting earlier. The coat was gone. Everett, they muttered, their voice barely audible, but they were alone now. The lights flickered again, and the whispers returned, faint and distant. And then they heard it. A voice, clear and distinct, coming from just outside the door. "Come back outside," it said. It was their own voice. The voice froze the psychiatrist in place. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was their voice, precise down to the subtle inflection, calling from the other side of the door. "Come back outside," it repeated, calm, almost soothing. "It's safe now." They shook their head, backing away from the door. Their mind raced, trying to anchor itself to reason, but nothing made sense anymore. The frost inching along the walls, the whispers crawling into their skull, Everett vanishing into the snow. It all defied logic, leaving only the suffocating certainty of the impossible. "Stop," they whispered, their voice shaking. "You're not real. You're not me," the voice responded, louder this time. "You don't have to be afraid. Just open the door and everything will make sense." They stumbled farther back, their pulse hammering. The frost was spreading faster now, its jagged tendrils creeping across the floor. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, each inhalation a knife in their chest, and then the door handle began to turn. "No," the psychiatrist said, their voice rising in panic. They grabbed the nearest chair, wedging it under the door handle. Just as the metal began to groan, the whispers outside grew frantic, overlapping and insistent. "Let us in. It's time to come home. You can't hide." The door shuddered, the frost along its edges cracking and falling in sharp fragments. Whatever was on the other side was trying to get through, and the psychiatrist felt that if it succeeded, there would be no coming back. Their eyes darted to the window. Outside, the storm raged on, the snow swirling in chaotic spirals. But amidst the chaos, shapes began to form, tall, indistinct figures moving through the white, their glowing blue eyes fixed on the outpost. The psychiatrist's breath caught. There were so many of them, dozens, maybe hundreds, circling the building like predators stalking wounded prey. The voice outside the door grew louder, shifting into a cold, cruel mimicry of their own tone. "You can't run forever. You'll break, just like the others." And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the whispers. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, pressing against the walls, the floor, their chest. They could feel the presence beyond the door, waiting, watching. The psychiatrist's thoughts raced. They couldn't stay here. The frost was spreading, the air was growing colder, and the thing outside wasn't going to stop. But if they went out into the storm, a sudden thought struck them. Everett's words, "It feeds on despair. The more you doubt, the stronger it gets." The realization settled like a stone in their gut. It wasn't just the storm or the cold or the whispers. It was the hopelessness, the fear. Every moment they gave in, every second they hesitated, was making it stronger. They forced themselves to take a deep breath, their frozen lungs burning with the effort. If they were going to survive, they had to fight it. The psychiatrist grabbed their flashlight and turned toward the door. The frost covered. Handle was still trembling, but the voices had fallen silent. Slowly, they reached for it, their gloved hand hesitating for only a moment before pulling the chair away. The door swung open with a loud creak, revealing the swirling chaos of the blizzard outside. The cold hit them like a wall, stealing the breath from their lungs. The figures in the snow stood motionless, their glowing eyes fixed on the psychiatrist. They could feel the weight of those stares, a pressure against their mind, urging them to step into the storm. "You're not real," they said aloud, their voice steady despite the terror clawing at their chest. "You're not real and you don't control me." The figures didn't move. The storm howled louder, the snow whipping around them in furious spirals, but the psychiatrist took a step forward, then another. "I'm not afraid of you," they said, louder this time. The shapes in the snow began to shift, their edges blurring and dissolving into the storm. The whispers returned, but now they sounded desperate, frantic. "Stay, don't leave, you can't escape." The psychiatrist pressed on, their steps deliberate, each one an act of defiance. The frost beneath their boots cracked and splintered, the tendrils retreating as if burned. They didn't know where they were going, but they didn't stop. The figures in the snow faded one by one, their glowing eyes winking out like dying stars, and then as suddenly as it had begun, the storm broke. The wind fell silent, the snow stopped swirling, the air grew warmer, and the faint glow of daylight pierced the clouds overhead. The psychiatrists stumbled, their legs nearly giving out beneath them. When they looked back, the outpost was gone, swallowed by the blizzard that now seemed impossibly far away. But they weren't safe yet. As they collapsed to their knees, the faintest whisper echoed in the back of their mind. "It's never over." Sitafar. Snow beneath their hands felt colder, sharper, like it was waiting for the right moment to strike. The psychiatrist stared into the empty horizon, the pale light casting long shadows across the ice. They didn't know if they had escaped or if the storm had simply let them go, for now. But deep down, they knew the truth. The blizzard wasn't just outside, it was inside. The first snowfall of the season came quietly in the night, blanketing the small town in a pristine layer of white. By morning, the streets were empty, save for a few bundled-up children trudging toward school, their boots crunching in the freshly fallen snow. Clara Hayes watched them from the classroom window as they shuffled across the playground, their heads bowed against the biting wind. She'd lived in the town for only a few months, but the winters here already felt endless. The old-school building creaked under the weight of the cold, its radiators sputtering in protest. Clara rubbed her hands together and glanced at the clock on the wall. The morning bell had already rung, but only half her students were seated, their jackets still zipped up and their scarves wrapped around their necks. They sat in silence, their faces pale, their eyes distant. "Good morning, everyone," Clara said, her voice bright, trying to inject some warmth into the frigid classroom. "How are we doing today?" The students mumbled half-hearted replies, their gazes drifting toward the windows. Clara frowned. The children had been growing quieter and more withdrawn with each passing week, but now there was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. "Let's start with some writing practice," she said, passing out sheets of lined paper. "I want you all to write a short story about winter. It can be anything you like, something fun, like sledding, or maybe about the snowball fights I hear you having during recess." The children shuffled in their seats, but didn't complain, dutifully picking up their pencils and beginning to write. Clara moved between the rows of desks, glancing at their work as she passed. Most of the stories were simple: sledding, snowmen, ice skating. But a few caught her attention. At Emily Carter's desk, Clara paused. The girl had drawn a snowman at the top of her page, but it was unlike any snowman Clara had ever seen. The face was too detailed, with sharp lines and hollow eyes. The snowman's mouth was twisted into a wide, unnatural smile, and the words beneath it read, "We give the cold a face, so it doesn't take ours." Clara's chest tightened. "Emily," she said softly, crouching next to the desk, "what does this mean?" Emily looked up at her, her wide blue eyes brimming with something Clara couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "It's just a story," the girl said, quickly, covering the drawing with her hands. "Does this have to do with the snowmen you've been building during recess?" Clara asked, her tone gentle. She'd noticed how the children spent their breaks clustered around the same spot on the playground, their mittened hands shaping snow into peculiar forms. Emily's gaze darted toward the window, where the snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes. "It's what we're supposed to do," she whispered. "Who told you that?" Clara pressed. Emily hesitated, then shook her head. "Nobody. It's just what we do in winter." Before Clara could ask more, the girl lowered her head and began writing again, her pencil scratching nervously against the paper. By the time lunch rolled around, the snow outside had picked up, swirling in gusts that rattled the windows. Clara watched the students pile out onto the playground, pulling their hoods tight against the wind. A few of the older kids trudged to the far end of the field, where the snow was deeper, and began building what looked like another snowman. Clara followed them with her gaze, her unease growing. There was something deliberate about the way they worked, something almost reverent. They moved in unison, patting the snow into a tall, narrow form before stepping back to carve a face into it with sticks. She was about to turn away when she saw one of the younger children, a boy named Sam, kneel in front of the snowman. He pressed his forehead to the snow, his small body trembling as if in prayer. "Miss Hayes!" Clara jumped, startled by the voice. It was Mrs. Vernon, the school secretary, standing in the doorway with a stack of papers. "Sorry," Clara said quickly, forcing a smile. "I was just watching the kids." Mrs. Vernon followed her gaze to the playground. "Oh, that," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "It's just their little winter game. They've been doing it for years. Keeps them busy." Clara frowned. "A game?" Mrs. Vernon nodded. "Building snowmen, carving faces, all part of growing up in a town like this? I suppose it's their way of making the winter less bleak." Clara didn't respond. Something about the children's behavior felt far from playful, but Mrs. Vernon was already bustling away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Later that afternoon, when the school day ended and the students shuffled out into the snow, Clara lingered in her classroom, tidying up the desks. She glanced out the window again, her gaze drawn to the spot where the children had built the snowman. It was still there, its face staring directly at her. Clara's stomach turned. She tried to tell herself it was her imagination, a trick of the light reflecting off the snow. But when she stepped outside and crossed the playground, the feeling only grew stronger. The snowman's face was unnervingly detailed, its eyes hollowed out to create deep, shadowy sockets. Its mouth was carved into a wide, unnatural grin that seemed to stretch too far. She knelt in the snow, examining it more closely. The face wasn't just crude lines scratched into the snow. It had depth, texture, almost like skin. Clara reached out to touch it, her fingers brushing against the cold surface. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, so soft she thought it might be the wind. But it wasn't coming from the air. It was coming from the snowman. She stumbled back, her breath clouding the frigid air. The whisper was gone as quickly as it had come, leaving only the sound of the wind howling through the playground. Shaking, Clara turned and hurried back to the school building, her boots crunching in the snow. As she reached the door, she glanced back over her shoulder. The snowman's face was still staring at her. The snow had intensified by the next morning, falling in thick sheets that blanketed the town and made the roads nearly impassable. Clara arrived at school later than usual, her car skidding on the icy streets. By the time she made it into the building, her boots were soaked and her fingers ached from the cold, despite her gloves. The school's old radiator groaned as it struggled to push warmth into the drafty classrooms. Clara peeled off her wet jacket, hung it near the heater, and went to check on her students. She passed through the hallway, which was quiet except for the faint creaks of the settling building. Her unease from the previous day lingered, but she shook it off, trying to focus on the tasks ahead. The snowman's whisper, it had to have been her imagination, a trick of her frayed nerves and the eerie silence of the playground. Yet the image of that hollow-eyed face lingered at the edges of her mind, refusing to be dismissed. When she entered her classroom, Clara stopped in her tracks. The children were already there, earlier than usual, sitting silently at their desks. Their jackets were still on, and their faces were pale, lips slightly blue from the cold. None of them looked up when she entered. "Good morning," she said cautiously. The students responded with a faint murmur, their voices low and lifeless. Clara walked to her desk, her eyes scanning the room. Several students were doodling in their notebooks, but the drawings weren't of the usual childish variety. They were all of snowmen, dozens of them, their faces detailed and grotesque. Some of the drawings had dark scribbles in the eyes, others had jagged mouths that seemed to stretch across the page. "Let's put those away for now," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly. The children obeyed without a word, sliding their notebooks into their desks. Clara tried to steady herself, taking a deep breath. "We'll start with math today," she said, her tone firmer now. "Open your books to page 50. The students moved sluggishly, as though weighed down by an invisible force. Clara's unease grew as the minutes dragged on. The classroom felt colder than usual, the radiators barely making a dent in the chill. She glanced toward the window, where the snow was still falling, blurring the outside world into a featureless white void. At recess, Clara watched the students from the warmth of the classroom, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. As expected, most of them gravitated toward the far end of the playground, where the snow was untouched and deeper. They formed a loose circle around the spot where the snowman had been the day before, their movements methodical. Curiosity and a growing sense of dread drove Clara outside. She wrapped herself in her coat and scarf, bracing against the biting wind as she crossed the playground. When she approached the group, the children didn't scatter as she expected. Instead, they turned to look at her, their faces blank and unreadable. "What are you all doing out here?" Clara asked, trying to keep her tone light. "We're making it better," one of the older boys said. His name was Daniel, and he had always been one of her more confident students. Now his voice was flat, his eyes glassy. "Making what better?" "The snowman," Emily said from beside him. She was patting snow into a rounded mound, her hands bare despite the cold. Clara crouched down next to her. "Emily, where are your gloves?" The girl didn't answer. She pressed her hands into the snow, her fingers red and raw, and began smoothing it into a shape. Clara reached out to stop her, but Emily recoiled, her movements quick and panicked. "Don't touch it," Emily cried, her voice high-pitched with fear. Clara froze, taken aback by the outburst. "Emily, you're going to hurt yourself. Your hands—" "It's not for you to touch," Emily said, her voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "Only we can do it." Clara stood, looking around at the other children. They were all focused on the snowman, shaping it with their hands, and carving faint impressions into its surface. "What do you mean it's not for me?" Clara asked. "It's for the cold," Emily said simply. Before Clara could ask more, Daniel spoke up. "It needs a face," he said, his voice low. The children all turned toward him, their heads nodding in eerie unison. "What are you talking about?" Clara demanded, her unease growing. Daniel didn't answer. He crouched in front of the snowman and began carving into it with a small twig. The other children watched in silence as he worked, their breath fogging the air in soft, rhythmic bursts. Clara felt a chill crawl up her spine as she watched. The face take shape. It was sharper, more detailed than anything a child should have been able to create. The eyes were deep hollows, the mouth stretched into a wide, jagged grin. "Stop," Clara said, her voice firm. "That's enough." The children ignored her. The snowman seemed to loom larger as the face took form, its grin twisting into something malevolent. "Stop it right now," Clara shouted, stepping forward to pull Daniel away. The boy turned to her, his expression unreadable. "If it doesn't have a face," he said quietly, "the cold will take one." Clara froze. The words hung in the air, heavy and unnatural. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Daniel didn't answer. The other children stared at her, their pale faces expressionless. For a moment, the only sound was the wind whipping through the playground, carrying faint whispers that Clara couldn't quite make out. Then the bell rang and the spell broke. The children scattered without a word, leaving the snowman half-finished. Clara stood alone in the snow, her heart pounding. The face on the snowman seemed to be watching her, its hollow eyes boring into her as if it knew something she didn't. She backed away slowly, the wind biting at her cheeks. As she reached the school building, she turned back for one last look. The snowman's grin had grown wider. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The wind outside battered her small house, rattling the old windows and seeping through the cracks beneath the doors. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the growing unease that had followed. Her home. The children's words echoed in her mind. "If it doesn't have a face, the cold will take one." She rolled over and glanced at her phone on the nightstand. It was well past midnight. Outside, the snow continued to fall, piling in drifts along the street and cloaking the town in an oppressive silence. Clara's house, tucked near the edge of town, felt unbearably isolated. A sudden noise made her sit up in bed. It was faint. At first, barely audible over the wind, but it grew louder, a soft, rhythmic crunching like footsteps in the snow. Clara's breath hitched. She reached for her phone and turned on the flashlight, the beam illuminating the room. She held her breath, listening intently. The sound came again. It was closer now, circling the house. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. The sound stopped for a moment, and she hesitated, hoping it was just her imagination. But then it started again, moving toward the front of the house. Clara wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and crept to the window, her heart pounding. She wiped away the fog on the glass and peered outside. The yard was a sea of white, the snow glistening under the dim glow of a streetlight. But something was wrong. There, in the middle of the yard, stood a snowman. Clara's stomach twisted. She hadn't built one. No one had been in her yard earlier that day. The snowman was tall, almost as tall as a person, and its face was disturbingly lifelike. The hollow eyes and jagged grin were etched with unnerving precision, the features so detailed. They seemed out of place in the frozen landscape. Clara backed away from the window, her pulse racing. She grabbed her phone and dialed the police, her hands trembling as she held it to her ear. "County Sheriff's Office," a gruff voice answered after several rings. "This is Clara Hayes," she said quickly. "I'm a teacher at the elementary school. Someone's been in my yard. They built a..." She paused, realizing how absurd it sounded. "They built a snowman. I didn't put it there." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, the sheriff sighed. "It's probably just kids playing a prank," he said. "Happens every winter. Don't worry about it." Clara gritted her teeth. "This isn't a prank. It's strange. It feels wrong." "Ms. Hayes, I've lived in this town my whole life," the sheriff said. "Trust me, this is nothing to worry about. The kids build snowmen everywhere this time of year. Go back to bed." Before she could protest, the line went dead. Clara stared at the phone in disbelief. She wanted to call back, to demand someone come and look, but she knew it would be pointless. She turned back to the window, hoping the snowman would somehow be gone. It wasn't. But now there were two. Clara stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. The second snowman was smaller, its face less defined but still unsettling. It stood just a few feet from the first, its hollow eyes staring directly at her window. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she backed away from the window. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet, the sound impossibly loud in the silence of the house. And then she heard it again, the crunch of footsteps in the snow. She froze, her blood turning to ice. The sound was coming from the side of the house now, slow and deliberate. She turned off the flashlight on her phone, plunging the room into darkness. The footsteps stopped just outside the window. Clara crouched low, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The wind howled outside, but beneath it, she thought she heard something else, a whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. A voice carried on the wind, speaking words she couldn't understand slowly. She rose just enough to peek over the edge of the windowsill. The snowman closest to the house now had a third figure beside it. But this one wasn't finished. Its torso was uneven, and its head was barely shaped, as if whoever had built it had been interrupted. Clara stared at it, her breath fogging the glass. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and for a moment she swore the unfinished snowman's head turned slightly toward her. She stumbled back, her pulse thundering in her ears. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. When dawn finally broke, the snowstorm had eased, leaving behind a grey, overcast sky. Clara hesitated before looking outside again, half expecting to see the snowmen still there, staring at her, but they were gone. The yard was pristine, untouched, as if nothing had ever been there. Clara exhaled shakily and grabbed her coat. She couldn't go to work without answers. Something was happening in this town, and she needed to know what. She drove straight to the library, her tires skidding on the icy roads. The building was empty, save for the librarian, an elderly woman who greeted Clara with a curious look. "What brings you in so early, dear?" the librarian asked. "I'm looking for information," Clara said, her voice tight. "About the town, about the winters here." The librarian's expression darkened. "That's an odd thing to ask about." "Please," Clara said, her voice wavering. "Anything about the history of the town, snowstorms or rituals?" The librarian studied her for a moment before nodding. "Wait here." Clara paced as the woman disappeared into the back. When she returned, she was holding a thin, yellowed book. The cover was plain, the edges frayed with age. "This is what you want," the librarian said quietly, handing it to her. Clara opened the book and began to read. What she found made her blood run cold. The book felt heavier in Clara's hands than it should have, the old leather cover creaking as she flipped through its brittle pages. It was a journal, handwritten and uneven, detailing a series of events that occurred decades ago. Events that eerily mirrored what she was experiencing now. The first entry was dated during the winter of 1978. The storm started 3 days ago, and it hasn't let up. The wind howls all night, and the snow has buried the roads. I've never seen the town like this before. People are frightened, but it's more than just the weather. Some of the children have started acting strangely. They go out into the snow, no matter how cold it gets, and build those awful snowmen. I don't know where they learned it, but it feels wrong. Clara's breath quickened as she skimmed ahead. The entries became more frantic, the handwriting growing sloppier as the days passed. It's not just the children. The snowmen are everywhere now, standing in yards and along the streets. Some of them are huge, too large for kids to have made them. They all have faces, detailed, lifelike faces. I swear I saw one move tonight. When I looked out my window, it was closer than it had been before. I told myself it was the wind, but I don't believe that anymore. She paused, her fingers trembling. The next page was covered in deep, jagged strokes of ink, as if the writer had pressed too hard with the pen. The faces. God help us. The faces. I see them in the snow now, even when there's no snowman. They whisper to me, telling me to join them. They say the cold is alive, that it needs us to survive. If we don't give it a face, it will take one. The words blurred as Clara's mind raced. She flipped ahead to the final entry, where the ink had smeared, as though the page had been splashed with water or melted snow. The children are. You're gone, all of them. We thought they were building snowmen, but they were building graves. The cold took them. It took them all. I hear it calling my name now outside my door. I won't let it take me. I won't give it my face. The last line was scrawled in large, uneven letters. Burn them. It's the only way. Clara slammed the book shut, her heart pounding. She looked up at the librarian, who was watching her with an expression of quiet understanding. This it can't be real, Clara said, her voice shaking. The librarian sighed and lowered her gaze. It's real enough, dear. The snow, the cold, it remembers. Every winter it comes back. But why? Clara demanded. Why would it take people? Why would the kids build those snowmen? The librarian hesitated, as if weighing whether to answer. They think it protects them, she said finally. That if they give the cold a face, it'll leave them alone. But it's not just the children. The whole town knows. We've always known. Clara felt her stomach twist. You're saying you let this happen? You let the children do these rituals every year? The librarian's expression hardened. It's not about letting them. It's about surviving. We all do what we have to. You'd be wise to leave it alone. Clara stared at her in disbelief. And the snowmen, the whispers, the faces, what are they? The librarian didn't answer. Instead, she simply turned and walked back behind her desk, leaving Clara alone with the book and the suffocating weight of the truth. Back at her house, Clara sat at the kitchen table, the journal open in front of her. The words seemed to pulse on the page, their meaning sinking deeper into her mind with every reread. The cold is alive. If we don't give it a face, it will. Take one. She glanced out the window. The yard was empty, the snow pristine, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was a message from Emily's mother. Hi, Ms. Hayes. I just wanted to let you know Emily won't be in school tomorrow. She's been upset since yesterday and says she's too scared to go outside. She keeps saying, the cold is angry. Clara stared at the message, her chest tightening. She typed out a quick reply, offering to check on Emily, but the mother didn't respond. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. Clara tried to distract herself, watched TV, made tea, paced the small living room, but nothing helped. The unease was unbearable, growing stronger as the night deepened. Finally, unable to take it anymore, she grabbed a flashlight and threw on her coat. She needed answers, and she wasn't going to find them sitting inside, waiting for the whispers to start again. She made her way to the edge of town, where the woods loomed dark and foreboding. This was where the children had been building the snowmen, the spot where she had seen them performing their strange ritual. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she stepped off the road and into the trees. The flashlight beams swept across the ground, illuminating patches of frost and gnarled roots. The air was colder here, heavier, and Clara's breath fogged the air in quick bursts. Then she saw it. In the clearing ahead, dozens of snowmen stood in neat rows, their faces turned toward her. Clara froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The snowmen were all different sizes, some barely taller than her knee, others towering over her. Their faces were grotesquely detailed, with hollow eyes and wide, jagged grins. She stepped closer, her heart hammering in her chest. The snowmen didn't move, but their presence felt oppressive, as if they were waiting for something. And then she saw the largest one. It stood at the center of the clearing, taller than any of the others, its face carved with terrifying precision. The hollow eyes seemed to follow her as she approached, and the grin stretched so wide it almost split the head in half. Clara's breath caught. She felt the cold pressing in around her, and the whispers began again. Soft at first, but growing. Louder with every step she took. "Who's doing this?" she shouted into the silence. Her voice echoed through the trees, but there was no response. The snowmen stared back at her, unblinking. And then, just for a moment, she swore she saw one. Of the move. The clearing felt alive. The cold wrapped around Clara like a second skin, biting into her flesh despite the layers she wore. Her flashlight beam wavered, bouncing off the rows of snowmen, their hollow eyes seeming to follow her every movement. She tried to convince herself it was her imagination, a trick of the shadows and the swirling wind, but deep down, she knew it wasn't. They were watching her. She took a tentative step forward, her boots crunching against the snow. The whispers, faint and disjointed, began to grow louder, threading through the cold air like an invisible web. They came from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping voices she couldn't quite understand. The largest snowman at the center of the clearing loomed ahead, its jagged grin frozen in an expression that sent a shiver down Clara's spine. The face was disturbingly lifelike, its details too precise, too deliberate. The hollows of its eyes seemed impossibly deep, as though they could swallow her whole if she stared too long. She clenched her flashlight tighter and forced herself to move closer. She had to understand. She had to know why this was happening. "Who did this?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whispers paused for the briefest moment, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then they returned, louder now. The words distorted and overlapping. "The cold remembers. We give it a face. It's watching you." Her flashlight flickered, the beam dimming as the batteries struggled against the cold. Clara's breath fogged in front of her, the mist curling in strange, unnatural patterns. "You can't scare me," she said aloud, though her voice cracked as she spoke. The snow seemed to shift around her, the drifts rising and falling as though the ground itself were breathing. The snowmen stood perfectly still, but Clara swore she could feel them leaning closer, their hollow eyes boring into her. Suddenly, one of the smaller snowmen near the edge of the clearing collapsed, its head toppling to the ground. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a suffocating silence. Clara's heart pounded as she turned to leave, her instincts screaming at her to run. But before she could take another step, she heard a sound, a faint, wet crunch. She froze. Slowly, she turned her head, her flashlight beam landing on the toppled snowman. The head was moving. Clara stared in horror as the severed snowman head rolled across the ground, its hollow eyes fixed on her. The jagged mouth began to shift, the snow cracking and splitting as it formed words. "Stay," it whispered, the voice raspy and cold. Clara stumbled back, her chest tightening. The whispers around her grew louder, angrier, echoing through the clearing like a chorus of unseen voices. She turned and ran. The snow whipped against her face as she sprinted through the forest, her flashlight swinging wildly. The trees loomed around her like shadowy figures, their branches clawing at her as she passed. The whispers followed her, weaving through the wind, urging her to stop, to turn back. "You can't run. Give us a face. The cold is hungry." Clara tripped over a root, hidden beneath the snow, and fell hard, the flashlight slipping from her grip. She scrambled to her knees, frantically searching for it. But the beam had already gone, out, leaving her in darkness. The whispers grew louder. She could feel the cold pressing against her, filling her lungs, making it harder to breathe. And then she saw it. A figure standing just ahead, barely visible in the dim light of the moon. It was tall and thin, its body blending into the snow like a shadow. Its face was blank at first, featureless, but as Clara stared, it began to change. The hollow eyes formed first, deep and dark, followed by a wide, jagged grin that stretched unnaturally across its face. It was the snowman, Clara's breath hitched as the figure took a step toward her, its movement slow and deliberate. The snow beneath its feet didn't crunch. It was silent, as though it was part of the storm itself. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You're not real." The figure tilted its head, the grin widening. The whispers grew deafening, the voices overlapping in a chaotic, maddening cacophony. Clara stumbled to her feet and ran, not knowing where she was going, only that she had to get away. When she finally burst out of the woods, she was gasping for air, her lungs burning from the effort. The snow-covered streets of the town stretched out before her, eerily empty. The houses were dark, their windows frosted over, as if the entire town had been swallowed by the cold. She staggered toward her house, her legs shaking, her body numb. The whispers had faded, but she could still feel the weight of the snowman's gaze, as though it were watching her even now. When she reached her front yard, she stopped dead in her tracks. They were there, snowmen, dozens of them, scattered across her yard. Their faces were all different, each one carved with disturbing precision. Some were twisted in expressions of rage, others in grotesque grins, but they all had one thing in common. They were facing her. Clara backed away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She didn't know how they had gotten there, or who had made them, but the sight of them made her stomach churn, and then she noticed the largest snowman standing directly in front of her porch. Its face was her own. Clara stumbled backward, her legs trembling as her gaze locked on the towering snowman in her yard. The face was unmistakably hers, every curve, every shadow captured with eerie precision. The hollow eyes stared back at her, and the snowman's wide, jagged grin seemed almost alive, twisting slightly as the wind swept through the yard. Her mind reeled. She had no memory of anyone being outside her house, let alone sculpting something so grotesquely lifelike. But it was there, undeniable, standing among the dozens of other snowmen that crowded her yard like silent sentinels. The cold seemed to thicken around her, pressing against her skin and filling her lungs. She clenched her fists, willing herself to move, to do something other than stand frozen in fear. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself, her breath fogging in the icy air. "This isn't happening." But it was real. The snowman's face was proof of that, as was the oppressive weight of the cold and the whispers that began to creep back into her ears. "You see us now. We gave you a face. It's your turn." "No," Clara shouted, the sound breaking the stillness of the night. "Leave me alone." The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus that seemed to come from every direction. The snowmen stood motionless, but their presence felt suffocating, as if the weight of their collective gaze was bearing down on her. Desperation took hold. Clara grabbed the closest thing she could find, a metal snow shovel leaning against the porch railing, and marched toward the snowman with her face. Her hands shook as she raised the shovel, the steel glinting in the faint light. "I'm not afraid of you," she said through clenched teeth, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. She swung the shovel, striking the snowman's face. The sound was dull, muffled by the dense snow, but the impact shattered part of the grinning mouth, sending chunks of frozen white tumbling to the ground. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was only silence, and Clara thought she had done it. She thought she had broken whatever spell the snowmen had cast over her. Then the ground beneath her feet shifted. The snow at the base of the snowman began to rise, moving as though alive, curling upward and latching onto the shovel. Clara yelped, stumbling back as the snow pulled the shovel from her hands, dragging it down into the icy ground. The whispers returned, louder now, filled with a new, vengeful edge. "You can't stop us. We gave you a face. The cold will take you." The snowman's shattered mouth began to reform, the jagged edges smoothing out as if the damage she'd caused had never happened. Its grin widened, more menacing than before. Clara turned, and ran into the house, slamming the door behind her. She locked it and pressed her back against the wood, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent, threading through the cracks in the walls. She stumbled into the kitchen, her mind racing. The book's final words flashed in her memory. Burn them. It's the only way. She fumbled through the drawers, pulling out a box of matches and a small can of lighter fluid. Her hands shook as she grabbed her coat and boots, shoving them on haphazardly before heading back to the door. Her resolve faltered as she looked out the window. The snowmen hadn't moved, but they felt closer, their faces more vivid in the moonlight. Do it, she whispered to herself. She threw open the door, clutching the lighter fluid like a lifeline. The wind howled around her, carrying the faint, mocking laughter of the whispers. She ignored it, focusing on the largest snowman. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she approached. The lighter fluid sloshed in the canister, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. She doused the snowman, her breath fogging in frantic bursts as she worked. The fluid soaked into the snow, darkening the pristine white. The whispers surged, a deafening cacophony. "Stop! You can't! It's too late!" Clara struck a match, her fingers trembling. The flame flared to life, casting flickering shadows across the snow. She hesitated, the weight of the cold pressing against her like an invisible hand. The snowman's hollow eyes seemed to plead with her, its grin twisting into something almost human. "Not this time," Clara said. Her voice shaking, she dropped the match. The fire roared to life, the flames leaping hungrily across the snowman's surface. The whispers screamed high-pitched and furious as the flames consumed the frozen figure. Clara stumbled back, shielding her face from the heat. The fire spread to the other snowmen, the flames racing across the yard like a living thing. One by one, the snowmen collapsed, their faces melting into nothingness as the fire devoured them. The whispers grew fainter, weaker, until they were little more than a distant echo. The air grew warmer, the oppressive weight of the cold lifting as the flames burned bright against the night. Clara fell to her knees, her chest heaving with relief. The snowmen were gone, reduced to charred patches of slush and ash. For the first time in days, the silence felt peaceful. But as Clara knelt in the snow, her breath slowing, she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. A single patch of untouched snow remained in the middle of the yard. And in that patch, the faint outline of a new snowman began to form. Clara stared at the untouched patch of snow, her relief twisting into dread. The outline of the new snowman was faint but undeniable, its form slowly taking shape as the cold wind swirled through her yard. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. Her legs felt like lead as she forced herself to stand. "I burned them. I stopped you." The air around her grew colder, sharper. The comforting warmth of the fire had vanished, replaced by the familiar, suffocating chill that sank into her bones. The whispers returned. Soft at first, like distant voices carried on the wind, but they grew louder with every passing moment. "You gave it a face. It will never stop. The cold is forever." The snow beneath her feet shifted as if alive. Clara stumbled back toward the porch, her breath fogging in frantic bursts. The charred remains of the snowmen she had burned seemed to mock her, their melted forms blending back into the snow like they had never existed. She turned her gaze back to the new snowman. It was fully formed now, standing tall in the center of the yard. Its face was blank, smooth as polished ice. For a moment, Clara dared to hope that was it, that the ritual had somehow reset and the nightmare would fade. But then, slowly, impossibly, the snowman's face began to change. Hollows formed where the eyes should be, dark and deep, and a wide grin carved itself across the surface. Clara's stomach churned as she realized the face wasn't hers anymore. It was Emily's. "No," Clara gasped, taking a step forward. "Leave her alone." The snowman didn't move, but the whispers rose into a deafening chorus. "The children belong to the cold. You can't save her. You are nothing." Clara fell to her knees, clutching her head as the voices clawed at her thoughts. Her vision blurred, the world spinning around her. She felt the cold seeping into her skin, into her mind, threatening to pull her under. But then she remembered the journal, the words scrawled in desperate, jagged strokes. Burn them. It's the only way. She forced herself to her feet, her body trembling. Her eyes darted to the gas can she had left on the porch, half empty but still usable. With every ounce of strength she had left, Clara sprinted back to the porch, grabbed the can, and turned to face the snowman. The whispers grew angrier, the wind howling around her, but she didn't stop. She doused the snowman with the remaining gas, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the can. The whispers turned into screams, shrill and furious, but Clara struck another match and threw it at the snowman. The flames roared to life, consuming the snowman in an instant. The hollow eyes seemed to widen, the jagged grin twisting into something like a scream as the fire spread. But it didn't stop. There, the snow around the snowman began to burn, the flames racing across the yard in a fiery wave. Clara stumbled back, her heart pounding as the fire consumed everything in its path. The remaining snow, the charred patches, even the untouched drifts. The whispers screamed louder, their voices blending into a single inhuman wail. The air around her grew impossibly hot, the snow melting into dark, steaming puddles. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fire went out. Silence fell over the yard. Clara stood motionless, her breath catching in her throat. The snow was gone, reduced to water and ash. The cold had lifted, replaced by an eerie stillness that felt heavier than the whispers had ever been. But the snowman was gone. For the first time in days, Clara allowed herself to hope. She sank to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion, and let out a choked sob. She didn't know how long she stayed there, staring at the scorched remains of her yard. But as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, she realized the whispers were truly gone. She stood, her legs unsteady, and made her way back into the house. For the next few days, the town felt different. The snow had melted in patches across the streets, and though it was still cold, the oppressive chill had lifted. The children at school were quieter, but their strange rituals had stopped. Clara kept a watchful eye on Emily, who seemed subdued but unharmed. The girl avoided Clara's gaze, but she no longer whispered about the cold. It was over. At least that's what Clara told herself. A week later, Clara woke to the sound of wind rattling her window. She sat up, her chest tightening as she looked. Outside, the snow had returned overnight, blanketing the town in white. Her breath fogged the glass as she leaned closer, her stomach twisting into knots. The yard was empty, pristine, untouched, but at the far edge of the property, near the tree line, she thought she saw something, a shape, small, round, and waiting. The whispers didn't return, but deep in her chest, Clara felt them anyway. It wasn't over. It would never be over. The cold always